Hi, I am really glad you made it back tonight. No matter how you found this video, no matter what kind of day you just had before clicking on it, take one slow breath right now and let your shoulders drop. Get comfortable because tonight we're not just telling a story. Tonight we're going looking for the beginning of you. Somewhere on an empty grassland more than 5,000 years before either of us was ever born, a small group of people stood around an open grave. They cried, they sang something we will never hear again, and they buried a man they loved under a mound of raw earth beside a wooden cart and a slaughtered horse. They had no way of knowing, none at all, that the family standing in that quiet circle would one day become ancestors to almost an entire continent. Grandparents in a strange sort of way to millions of people who would be born centuries later in places these mourners never even knew existed. Maybe one of those people is you. Before we step into that grave together, let's get settled properly first. If tonight's story pulls you in even half as much as I hope it will, a quiet tap on that subscribe button, or a like, or even just a comment down below would mean more than you probably realize. It really is the only way I know these late night stories are landing the way they're supposed to, and I am always curious about one small thing. Where are you tonight? Curled up under a blanket, driving home with the radio down low, maybe already half asleep on the couch? Tell me down in the comments. I go through every single one, and I love hearing where these stories find you. Now dim the lights if you can. Turn on a fan or anything with a soft, steady hum, something to turn this room into a little cocoon just for the next while. Get settled in, let's begin. More than 5,000 years ago, long before Rome had a single stone laid, long before anyone had even dreamed up the pyramids of Egypt, a wide grassland stretched from the edge of the Black Sea toward a horizon that never seemed to end. The grass moved in slow waves under an enormous open sky, pale gold in the dry months, silver green after rain. There were no walls out there, no streets, no permanent homes at all, just sky and grass and the small moving world of the people who spent their entire lives on top of it, following their animals from one good patch of ground to the next, packing up everything they owned every few weeks and starting over somewhere new. For one family that particular season the grass had gone quiet. A man had died. Not old, not young either. Somewhere in the middle, the kind of age where a person has already buried people they loved and already taught children how to survive out there on their own. Historians will never know his real name. Nobody around him could put a single word down on anything. Not on stone, not on clay, not anywhere, because writing simply did not exist yet in his part of the world. So just for tonight, let's give him one anyway. Let's call him Aru. Aru had spent his whole life moving with animals. Cattle sheep, maybe a small herd of horses trailing along behind the group as they crossed that grassland season after season, year after year. Home for someone like Aru was never one single place on a map. Home was wherever the group happened to stop that particular week, wherever there was still good grass left to eat, and wherever the sky looked calm enough to sleep under. When he died, word travelled the way it always did back then, not through a phone, not through a screen, but slowly camp by camp, carried by a rider crossing the grass on foot or on horseback for a day, sometimes two. Families who had shared meals with Aru years earlier, families connected to his by marriage, by old debts, by simple friendship, began arriving from every direction. They came with felt blankets rolled over their shoulders with dried meat and sour milk to share with children too young to understand exactly what death meant, only that the adults around them had gone unusually quiet. Somewhere near the grave, a fire was kept burning through the night. People took turns sitting beside it. Nobody wanted Aru's wife or his oldest son sitting there completely alone. Aru's wife stood closest to the pit when the digging finally stopped. She was not an old woman, not yet, though grief has a way of making a person look older within the space of a single night. Beside her stood their oldest son, maybe 14 or 15 summers into his life, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, too young to know yet how to carry it. He had spent that whole last week walking beside his father, learning which grasses the cattle preferred and which ones they would refuse to touch even if they were starving. Now he stood holding the reins of an animal that would not be walking anywhere ever again. An elder from a neighbouring family began to sing low and unhurried, a song passed down through more mouths than anyone could count, one none of us will ever get to hear correctly because melodies like that one do not survive on stone the way names sometimes do. The whole camp fell into that particular kind of silence that only happens once, right before something is lowered into the ground for good. And when it was finally time, his family did something that would seem almost unbelievable to the people who eventually found his grave thousands of years later. They dug a deep pit straight down into the earth. They lined the sides with wood and laid Aru inside on his back knees, drawn up gently almost like he was only sleeping in the middle of a long afternoon. Someone rubbed a bright red powder across his body, and his belongings, a mineral pigment we now call ochre, the very same red dust used in grave after grave across this grassland for generations before him. Nobody today can say for certain what that colour meant to them. Blood, maybe. Life somehow held on to a little longer. Or something we simply do not have a word for anymore in any language still spoken on this earth. Beside him they placed a wagon, not a toy, not something carved just for the occasion. A real working wagon built from solid timber with heavy wheels cut from single thick planks of wood. Some of the oldest wheeled vehicles ever discovered anywhere on the planet have come out of graves, almost exactly like this one on this same stretch of grassland. And beside that wagon they laid down an animal, an ox in some graves, a horse in others, worth more in practical terms than almost anything else a family could ever hope to own. Killed and buried alongside him, so that Aru would not have to walk wherever he was going next. Sit with that for just a second. In a world with no coins, no banks, nothing sitting behind a glass counter at a jewellery shop, an entire family's fortune could be standing right there on 4 legs, breathing chewing grass every single morning. And on the day this man died, his family looked at their own wealth, their own survival really, and buried a piece of it in the ground with him, instead of keeping it for themselves. That is not a small gesture. That is closer to burying a house, or handing someone the keys to a brand new truck and just dropping them into the grave and walking away. Try explaining that one to an insurance agent 5,000 years later. Compare that just for a moment to the settled farming villages sitting far to the west of this grassland, at roughly the same point in time, communities we will spend real time with soon enough. Those villages measured a family's worth in fields, in mud brick walls, in grain stored away for winter, things rooted firmly to one particular patch of soil. Out here on the open steppe, worth walked around on its own 4 legs, and could be moved anywhere in a single afternoon. 2 entirely different ways of answering the exact same question every human society eventually has to answer. What matters enough to protect, and what are we willing to give up to prove it? Over the pit they began piling earth. Not just a few careless shovels worth. Basket after basket carried by hand from somewhere nearby, dumped and packed and shaped by an entire community, working together, arms, aching palms raw, until a mound rose up out of the flat grassland, sometimes taller than a grown man, sometimes wide enough to be seen from a great distance in every direction. Nobody worked alone that day. Neighbours who had walked for hours to be there picked up baskets right alongside Aru's own sons, and nobody once suggested they had already helped enough and could rest. That more than the wagon, more than the ochre, more than anything else buried in that pit tells you something true about who these people were. Later generations would build their own mounds nearby, layer after layer, family after family, until small hills stood scattered across that empty steppe. Like punctuation marks on a page, nobody stayed behind to translate for us. We have a name for those mounds now. We call them kurgans. Thousands of them still rise out of the grass today across southern Russia, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, low green hills that look almost natural until you know what to look for. If you have ever flown over that part of the world and glanced down at the ground far below your window seat, there is a real chance you have looked directly at one of Aru's neighbours without ever knowing what you were seeing. Here is the part that gets me honestly every single time I sit with this story. The people burying Aru that evening were not thinking about history. They were not thinking about being studied one day, carefully dug up or talked about on a quiet night thousands of years later by someone whose entire language did not exist yet. They were only thinking about him, about missing him already, about doing right by a man they loved in exactly the same way any of us would want to be sent off by the people who knew us best at our worst and stayed anyway. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming, because the people standing around that grave, the ones who built that mound with their own 2 hands, who buried that wagon and that animal in the red earth beside him, scientists would eventually give them a name too. Not the name they called themselves. We lost that a very long time ago, somewhere between the pit and the present. Researchers call them the Yamnaya, now a word borrowed from an old Russian term simply meaning pit, because of the way these graves were always dug straight down into the ground rather than out to the side. A fairly plain practical name, honestly, for people who were about to do something that was anything but plain. Within just a few centuries of that quiet funeral, families exactly like Aru's would begin moving. Slowly at first. Wagon by wagon, herd by herd, spreading outward across an entire continent in a way almost nobody standing at that grave could have possibly imagined. By the time they were finished, they would not simply visit Europe. They would change it all the way down to the deepest level a person can possibly be changed. Not only its languages, not only its tools, its pottery, its way of building a home, its blood, its bones. The actual genetic code passed down inside nearly every family living across that landscape today, including, statistically speaking, a fairly large number of people watching this video right now on whatever screen you happen to be holding. If you've ever spat into a small plastic tube, mailed it off somewhere, and waited weeks for a percentage breakdown of where your own ancestors supposedly came from, there is a specific line on that report worth remembering tonight. Somewhere in that pie chart, quietly labelled with a name most people scroll straight past, sits a piece of Aru. Not a metaphor. An actual measurable fraction of the same bloodline that stood crying around that pit on the grassland, still travelling forward, family by family, all the way to whatever device is lighting up your face right now. But to understand how a handful of grieving families on an empty grassland ended up quietly rewriting the biology of an entire continent, we need to leave this grave behind for a moment and travel back even further to a very different Europe altogether. A gentler one in a lot of ways. One filled with painted clay figurines, quiet farming villages, and a way of life that had already lasted longer than almost anything human beings have built, since right up until the world Aru's family belonged to came walking slowly, unstoppably straight through the middle of it. A world that had absolutely no idea people like Aru even existed yet. Let's actually step into that other world for a moment, the one nobody standing at that grave had ever heard a single word about. Because while families on the grassland were burying their dead under mounds of raw earth, something very different had already been quietly humming along for thousands of years, just a bit farther to the west along the wide river valleys of what is now Ukraine, Moldova and Romania. Picture this instead. No wagons, no wandering herds. Fields of wheat and barley planted in the same soil year after year, tended by people who had never once packed up an entire household and started walking somewhere new. if Aru's world was built on constant motion, this one was built on staying put and staying put. It turns out can build something rather extraordinary given enough centuries to work with. There is a settlement archaeologist called Talianki sitting on a stretch of open ground in what is now central Ukraine, and I want you to really sit with the size of this place for a moment, because most people, even people who love history, have simply never heard of it. At its height, somewhere around 6,000 years ago, Talianki covered well over 300 hectares of ground. Picture something close to 500 football fields laid edge to edge, and now imagine nearly every inch of that space filled with homes. Researchers studying the site have estimated a population somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people, all living inside a single settlement, arranged in wide, deliberate rings around a vast open plaza at the centre, almost like the growth rings inside a very old tree. Here's the detail that tends to stop people cold once they hear it properly. This place was larger than most of the early city-states rising up around the same period in Mesopotamia, the region usually credited in textbooks as the birthplace of civilization. Taliankian settlements, very much like it, were already standing for centuries before the first walls of Uruk were even finished. And yet ask the average person on the street to name one Mesopotamian city, and they will probably manage it. Ask them to name a single settlement from this river valley world, and you will most likely get silence. History has a strange habit of playing favourites, and I've always found that a little unfair to the people who quietly got there first. Mention Egypt at a dinner party, and everyone nods along politely. Mention Talianki, and you will likely spend the next 5 minutes just explaining how to pronounce it. That imbalance says far more about which stories got written down early and repeated often than it says about which ones actually mattered. What strikes me most honestly, digging through what we know about this place, is what is missing. No palace at the centre, no fortress walls ringing the outside, no single house standing dramatically larger than its neighbours stuffed with weapons or treasure. Just home after home after home, roughly the same size, arranged with what looks, at least on the surface, like real intention toward fairness. Some researchers who study these mega-settlements describe them as something close to a levelling experiment, a community that may have deliberately organised itself to prevent any one family from towering too far above the rest. Now I want to pause here and ask you something, because I am curious. Have you ever walked through a small old town and just felt how long people had been living there, layered under your feet, generation stacked quietly on generation? That feeling, whatever it actually is the closest thing I can offer you to what archaeologists describe standing in the middle of a site like this one. Try to actually picture an ordinary morning inside one of those homes. Painted pottery drying outside a doorway decorated with spirals so precise that some archaeologists truly wonder whether entire families specialised in nothing else. A woman grinding grain against a flat stone worn smooth by her own mother's hands and her grandmother's before that. Children weaving between the houses, chasing something, the way children everywhere on this planet always seem to be chasing something. None of it dramatic. None of it built for a history video, honestly, which might be exactly why almost nobody remembers it. We tend to build our stories around conquest and catastrophe, and quietly forget the much longer, much stranger story of people who simply figured out how to stay somewhere together for 2,000 years without falling apart. But here is where the story gets strange, and I mean properly strange in a way that still does not have a clean answer. Every 60 to 80 years or so, for reasons nobody has ever fully settled on, the people of these river valley towns burn their own homes to the ground. Not by accident, not through war, and not through some careless cooking fire that got out of hand. On purpose, and apparently together as an entire community, based on how evenly the ash layers sit underneath these sites when archaeologists dig down through them. Then, Not far away, sometimes practically next door, they built the whole town again from scratch. Try explaining that particular renovation plan to a modern homeowners association. Every couple of generations, we simply light the whole neighborhood on fire and start fresh. No permits required apparently when you're the only rule-making body for several hundred miles in every direction. Nobody agrees on why they did it. Some researchers lean towards something almost spiritual, a kind of ritual death and rebirth built directly into the architecture of daily life, a way of saying that a home like a person was never meant to last forever. Others point toward far more practical explanations, pest infestations, that made a house unlivable, or roofing timbers that had simply rotted past saving after enough winters. My honest opinion, for whatever it is worth sitting here telling you about it tonight, is that it was probably both at once. Human beings are rarely purely practical or purely spiritual about anything that matters to them. We tend to wrap the two together so tightly that a few thousand years later, nobody can fully pull them apart again. And maybe that is exactly the point. Maybe it was never meant to be pulled apart. Now, this river valley world was not the only version of old Europe worth knowing about tonight. Down along the shore of the Black Sea in what is now Bulgaria, a very different kind of story was unfolding at roughly the same stretch of time, and it complicates the picture in a way I actually find more interesting than a simple, tidy narrative would allow. In the autumn of 1972, a man named Rachel Marinov was operating an excavator near the coastal city of Varna, clearing ground for what was supposed to become a factory. Instead, his machine turned up something that has been sitting quietly underground for well over 6,000 years. A cemetery. Nearly 300 graves holding among them more than 3,000 separate gold objects, older than any worked gold ever found anywhere else on the planet, predating the pyramids of Egypt by well over 1,000 years. Most of those graves held almost nothing. A single bead, a small flint blade, the ordinary modest belongings of an ordinary modest life. But a handful of graves held something else entirely. One in particular, catalogued simply as grave number 43, belonged to a man in midlife laid to rest, with an almost unbelievable quantity of gold beads bracelets, a ceremonial scepter more gold according to researchers than had been recovered from every other site on Earth from that same era combined into one single burial. A few graves in that same cemetery held no body at all, just gold, and a clay mask shaped roughly like a human face laid out exactly where a head should have been. Nobody has ever fully explained those particular graves either. Some mysteries, it turns out, are simply allowed to stay mysteries. Sit with the math on that for a second, because it matters. Out of roughly 300 graves, just a small handful accounted for most of the wealth buried in that ground. That is not a levelling experiment. That is something closer to the very first hint of the kind of gap between rich and poor that most of us would recognise instantly if we saw it playing out today, just dressed in beads and copper axes instead of anything we would recognise on a bank statement. Here's a strange thought to sit with for a moment. If someone dug up your own belongings 6,000 years from now, what would the ratio look like? How much would be ordinary, and how much would quietly announce that you mattered more than the person next door? It is not really a question about the past at all, if you think about it honestly. And this world was not sitting in isolation either, which is another detail I think gets lost too easily. Farther west across the Balkans, a related farming culture archaeologists call the Vinca. People had already been digging copper out of the ground at a site called Rudna Glava, in what is now eastern Serbia, using stone hammers and fire to crack the rock apart among the very earliest organised copper mining anywhere on the planet. And scattered through graves and homes across this entire region from the Balkans all the way up into the river valleys, we just left behind, archaeologists keep finding a particular kind of shell, thick pink and unmistakably Mediterranean, the shell of a creature called Spondylus, a creature that never once made its home anywhere near these inland towns. Somebody carried those shells hundreds of miles inland hand to hand, trading partner to trading partner, carved into bracelets and beads that meant enough to someone that they were worth carrying that far. Say what you want about how peaceful or hierarchical this world truly was underneath it all, but a network like that does not survive on conquest. It survives on trust repeated often enough over long enough distances that total strangers kept agreeing to honour it. So here is the piece of this puzzle that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it happens to be the part I find the most quietly fascinating. For a long time, this whole river and coastline world got wrapped up in a rather romantic idea, largely thanks to an archaeologist named Maria Gimbutas, working through the middle of the last century. Her theory painted this world as a kind of peaceful, mother-centered paradise, one where small clay figurines of full-bodied women, thousands of them dug out of homes across this entire region, pointed toward a spiritual life built around a goddess rather than a god, a culture supposedly gentler and more equal than almost anything that came after it, right up until outsiders from the grasslands supposedly rode in and ended it. It is a beautiful story. I understand completely why it took hold the way it did, and why plenty of people still love it today. But the honest picture the one careful researchers keep circling back to is messier than that in the way real history almost always ends up being messier than the version that fits neatly onto a poster. Those figurines might represent goddesses. They might just as easily represent ancestors or fertility charms, or something we do not have a modern word for at all because we buried the correct word along with everyone who once knew it. And that grave in Varna sitting there loaded down with gold, and a sceptre meant for exactly one man tells its own rather different story, one about hierarchy and status, and a very human hunger to be remembered as more important than your neighbour. Some of the very researchers who study this region most closely have pointed to graves like that one as an early sign that something resembling male-dominated hierarchy may have already been quietly taking root here, long before a single wagon or wandering herd from the grassland ever crossed anywhere near these river valleys, which raises a question I actually think about more than I probably should. What if the ending most of us assume for this world outsiders sweeping in and crushing something purely peaceful is not quite the whole truth? What if peace and hierarchy were already sitting right there together side by side the exact same way they still do in almost every human society we have ever managed to build since? I will let you sit with that question instead of answering it for you, because I do not think there is a clean answer waiting at the bottom of it. What we can say with real confidence is this. By the time this particular chapter of old Europe finally closed whatever the true mix of causes turns out to have been, these river valley towns and coastal settlements had already stood in one form or another for well over 2,000 years. Longer than the entire span separating you right now from the founding of Rome. Generation after generation had been born, married, buried, and remembered inside those concentric rings of homes, and along that gold-lined coastline, never once suspecting that any of it might end. They built no standing armies. Most of these settlements had no defensive walls to speak of at all, which tells you something quietly important about how safe they must have felt, tucked away inside their own wide, fertile corner of the world. Whatever quarrels or rivalries occasionally flared up between neighbouring towns, and there is some evidence a few did none of it, seems to have prepared them for anything arriving from very far outside their own familiar horizon. Safety, when you have known nothing else for 2,000 years, has a way of feeling less like luck and more like a permanent fact of the world, the same way most of us quietly assume the ground will stay solid under our feet tomorrow morning, right up until the one day it does not. But something was arriving, slowly, patiently, from a direction nobody in these painted settled towns had any real reason to be watching, because nothing had ever come from that direction before that actually mattered. To understand where that something came from and how it eventually managed to reach every single one of these communities, the gold-heavy graves along the coast, and the painted rings of homes farther inland alike, we need to leave the fields and the shell trade and the burned houses behind for a little while, and go back to the grass itself. Not to a funeral this time, and not to a monument loaded down with treasure, but to the plain, unglamorous, everyday work of learning how to survive on ground that nobody else had quite figured out how to use yet. Because that, as strange as it might sound, sitting here in a warm, quiet room, so many thousands of years later, is where this particular story actually begins. Not with a conquest, not at first. With a handful of ordinary families slowly, almost accidentally becoming very good at something nobody else around them had ever bothered to master. Here is a strange fact worth sitting with before we go any further. We just spent a good while inside houses, walking through painted rooms, standing in the ashes of towns that burned themselves down on purpose. And now we're switching to a people who left behind almost none of that. No streets to map, no walls to measure, no ash layers marking where a roof once stood. If you wanted to dig up an actual Yamnaya home tomorrow morning, you would struggle to find one. What you would find scattered across an almost unimaginable stretch of open ground are their dead. Thousands and thousands of them resting under mounds that still rise out of the grass today. We know these people almost entirely by how they died rather than how they lived, which is a strange, slightly haunting way to get to know anyone. So who actually were they underneath all that grass and all that mystery? The honest answer starts, oddly enough, not on the steppe at all, but tucked away in a pocket of the Caucasus Mountains sometime deep in the last ice age. While glaciers ground their way across most of the northern half of this continent, a small population of hunters found a corner of that mountain range sheltered enough to simply wait the whole thing out. Generation after generation cut off from almost everyone else on the planet, they survived somewhere most other people could not. Geneticists studying their remains today gave them a fairly plain working title, Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers, though I have always thought that name undersells just how remarkable their survival actually was. Farther north across the river valleys and forest edges of what is now Western Russia and Ukraine, a completely different population was doing its own version of the same thing, hunting, fishing, following herds of wild game through a colder, flatter world. Scientists call this group Eastern hunter-gatherers, distant cousins in the broadest sense to ancient populations even farther east in Siberia. For thousands of years, these two groups had almost nothing to do with each other. Different mountains, different rivers, different entire worlds, really. Picture the two of them for a second completely unaware of one another, going about lives separated by hundreds of miles of forest, steppe and stone. One group huddled in narrow mountain valleys, through the coldest stretches the planet had thrown at anyone in a very long time, learning every fold in that particular landscape well enough to survive it. The other spread out across flatter, colder ground farther north, following herds of wild game across territory that must have felt to them like the entire known world. Neither one had the faintest idea the other existed. And yet, according to the DNA sitting quietly inside millions of people alive today, their futures were already tangled together centuries before either group could have possibly known it. And then sometime round 6,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on which research team you ask, people carrying ancestry from both of these populations began meeting, mixing and building families together along the river corridors, connecting the Caucasus to the open steppe farther north. Slowly, over more generations than anyone bothered counting, at the time a new blended population took shape, one that would eventually spread wider and faster than either of its two original halves ever had on their own, I find something quietly moving about that honestly, if you let yourself sit with it for a second instead of rushing past it as just another line of genetics. An entire population born because two completely separate groups of Ice Age survivors, each one holding on by a thread in its own corner of the world, eventually found each other. Researchers studying the fine details of this admixture in just the last couple of years have suggested the mix leaned more heavily toward that southern Caucasus ancestry than earlier studies first assumed, closer to 4/5 in some of the newest modelling. The exact ratio keeps shifting slightly as better tools and more samples come along, which honestly is exactly how good science is supposed to work. Nobody gets to plant a flag on the final answer too early. There is one more detail from this same research worth quietly filing away for later, because it will matter quite a bit before tonight is over. Almost every single male skeleton pulled from these early steppe graves carries the same narrow branch on the human family tree, a particular marker passed only from father to son, generation after generation, almost without exception. Whatever was happening inside these early herding families, fatherhood inheritance, who exactly got to start a new household and who did not, it was apparently happening in a remarkably narrow, remarkably consistent way. We will come back to that thread shortly. For now, just keep it somewhere in the back of your mind. Think about your own family tree for a moment if you have ever actually traced it. How many completely different regions, completely different peoples, had to somehow cross paths, fall in together, or simply collide purely by circumstance for you to end up exactly the way you are sitting, right where you are sitting tonight? It is rarely one clean line. It is almost always a collision of several. By around 6,000 years ago, give or take, this blended population carrying what researchers now simply call steppe ancestry had settled into the river valleys of the Volga, the Don and the Dnipro, the same wide grassy corridor separating the painted farming world we just left behind from the open dry plateau farther east. And for a good while they lived roughly the way their ancestors on both sides had lived, fishing the rivers, hunting what game they could find, keeping a modest number of cattle and sheep near home the way a farmer might keep chickens today, useful, but not the whole point of the operation. Then somewhere nearly 5,300 years ago something shifted, and we can actually watch it happen. Not through any story passed down, but through something far stranger and far more intimate. Their teeth. Dental plaque, it turns out, is a surprisingly loyal witness. Once it hardens into calculus along the base of a tooth, it can trap tiny fragments of protein from whatever a person regularly ate, and those fragments can survive readable for thousands of years. Researchers scraping that hardened plaque from people living along these rivers before that date found almost no trace of milk in it at all. Mostly fish, mostly wild game, an occasional taste of meat from a domesticated animal, more special occasion than daily habit. Then right round that same narrow window of time the plaque changes completely. Milk proteins show up everywhere, cattle, sheep, goat, and in a handful of individuals even faint traces of horse milk, within what looks on an archaeological timescale like almost no time at all. An entire population had gone from occasionally eating an animal to living directly off what that same animal could keep providing day after day for years, without ever needing to be killed at all. It is worth asking why this particular trick took so long to catch on, given that people had been herding cattle and sheep in this same general region for a good while already. Meat alone spoils fast, especially in the warmer months, which meant a family living mostly off meat still needed to stay near a river, near fish, near something reliable they could fall back on between successful hunts. Milk changes that equation completely, but only once you can also solve the much less glamorous problem of keeping it useful for more than a single afternoon. Turn it into a hard cheese or a fermented, slightly sour paste, that keeps for weeks folded inside a leather bag, and suddenly you are no longer feeding a family off whatever happens to wander past today. You are feeding them off a walking, breathing, endlessly renewing supply line that travels wherever you decide to go next. That is the quieter, less cinematic invention sitting underneath all of this. Not the wagon. Not even the animal itself. The patient, unglamorous trick of making food last long enough to stop needing a river at all. I think that shift matters more than people usually give it credit for. And here is the comparison that makes the most sense to me sitting here, thinking it through with you tonight. It is roughly the difference between earning a single one-time payment and setting up something that quietly pays you every single morning for as long as you keep taking care of it. Once you can survive on milk, on cheese, on whatever early sour yogurt-like ferment they were producing in leather bags slung over the side of a wagon, you no longer need to stay anywhere near a river full of fish or a field full of grain that only ripens once a year. You need grass. And on the open Pontic Caspian Steppe, stretching out toward a horizon that never once seemed to end, there was more of that than any other single resource on the entire landscape. That is the piece that always gets slightly buried under the more dramatic parts of this story, the wagons, the graves, the eventual migration. The real invention here was not really the wagon at all, brilliant as it was. The real invention was realizing that grass, endless, useless-looking grass that no farmer on earth could do a single thing with, could be quietly converted through the patient, unglamorous work of herding into something you could eat, drink, wear, and carry with you anywhere you were willing to walk. Farmers needed the right soil sitting in the right place forever. Herders, once they figured this out properly, needed almost nothing but open sky and the will to keep moving. And move they did. Within a handful of centuries of that dietary shift showing up in their teeth-related populations carrying this same steppe, ancestry had spread across a stretch of territory roughly 6,000 kilometers wide, linking herding communities as far apart as Scandinavia in the west and the Altai Mountains on the edge of Mongolia in the east. Try holding that distance in your head for a second. Load up a map of the entire width of the United States coast to coast, and you would still need to keep driving for days after you hit the water on either side, just to cover the same ground. These related herding families eventually reached mostly on foot, behind a small number of oxen, without a single road bridge or written map to guide any of it. That is not a village expanding into the next valley over. That is closer to one extended family, loosely speaking, ending up on opposite ends of an entire landmass within a handful of lifetimes. Can I be honest with you about something? When I first went digging through the research behind that particular fact, I actually had to put it down and just stare at the wall for a minute. We're used to thinking about ancient migration as something painfully slow, a one stubborn mile at a time across centuries nobody living through it could ever measure. And in most of human history that is exactly what it was. But every once in a while a group figures out one specific trick, in this case turning grass into a portable renewable food source, and the whole rule book for how far people can travel and how quickly simply gets rewritten. None of this happened because anyone on that steppe was thinking in terms of continents or conquest, or changing the course of European history. I want to be careful here because I think it is easy to look backward and hand ancient people a grand plan they never actually had. Nobody sat around a fire 5,000 years ago and announced they were about to reshape a landmass. They were almost certainly just trying to feed their children a little more reliably than their parents had managed to, and trying to find slightly better grass than whatever the last valley had offered. Big historical change, more often than most of us like to admit, grows out of small, practical, slightly boring decisions, repeated by enough people for long enough that they eventually stop looking small at all, So here is a fair question worth turning over in your own head for a second before we go any further tonight. Between the two, the wagon that could finally carry a household's belongings across open ground, and the quiet, patient trick of learning to survive on milk instead of meat alone, which one do you think actually mattered more? I honestly go back and forth on that one myself, and I am not sure there is a single correct answer waiting at the bottom of it. What I do think we can say with real confidence is this. Once a family could feed itself almost entirely off animals that stayed alive and kept producing, and once that same family could load everything they owned onto a set of wooden wheels and simply follow the best grass wherever it happened to be growing. That particular season, wealth stopped being something tied down to one plot of land forever. It started walking around on its own, 4 legs instead, breathing, multiplying, occasionally wandering off if nobody was watching closely enough. And once wealth can move and multiply and occasionally slip away in the night if a neighbouring family gets there first, something else tends to happen inside a society almost automatically. Some families end up with far more of it than others. Some end up with almost none. And the people holding the largest herds, the ones who could feed the most mouths and field the most wagons, start to matter in ways that ripple straight through every single choice that community makes next about marriage, about leadership, about who gets buried with almost nothing, and who gets sent into the ground surrounded by everything they owned. We already caught a small glimpse of that back at the very beginning of tonight's story, standing around one particular grave on one particular afternoon, watching a family bury nearly everything they owned alongside a man they loved. What we have not really looked at yet is the bigger, colder pattern sitting underneath that single funeral. Who exactly held the power in a world built on grass and movement instead of fields and stone walls? Whether that narrow, consistent line passed down from father to son actually explains why some families ended up with sprawling herds, while others apparently owned almost nothing worth burying at all. And whether that kind of power, once it took root out there on the open steppe, ever really belonged to everyone equally in the first place, or whether it settled quietly and almost immediately into the hands of a fairly narrow, fairly specific group of people, long before a single wagon ever crossed into anyone else's territory. Remember that detail I asked you to quietly file away a little while ago, the one about fathers and sons? Let's go back and actually open that up properly now, because it turns out to be one of the more revealing threads in this entire story. Here is what researchers mean in plain terms when they talk about a population being patrilineal. A very particular, very narrow line gets passed down from father to son, generation after generation, almost without interruption. Not a name written on paper, obviously, since nobody out here was writing anything down yet. Something quieter than that, carried inside the body itself, inside a single thread of the human genome that only travels one direction, father to son, on and on, largely untouched by anything happening on the mother's side of the family. And across an enormous number of early steppe burials, that particular thread keeps turning up remarkably uniform, which tells us something rather blunt about how power and property were actually organised out there on the grass. Sons inherited from fathers. Daughters, in the vast majority of cases, appear to have left their birth families behind entirely and joined their husbands' communities instead. Property, whatever counted as wealth in a world built on animals rather than land, stayed locked inside the male line tightly, deliberately, generation after generation. If you want a slightly cheeky modern comparison picture, a family business that never once considers selling to an outside buyer, no matter how many centuries pass, no matter how many better offers come along. The eldest son always takes over. The name over the door never changes. Somewhere a great many generations later, that same stubborn instinct is probably the reason a handful of surnames still show up disproportionately often on the results of a modern ancestry test long after almost everyone involved has forgotten exactly why. It is a strange kind of immortality achieved not through anything anyone would call heroic, just sheer quiet persistence, repeated often enough that it eventually stops looking like chance at all. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you something, because I think it lands differently depending on how you have lived your own life. Have you ever thought about how many entire family lines simply vanished along the way, quietly without anyone even noticing at the time, while one or two stubborn branches somehow kept going right down to you sitting exactly where you are tonight? Most of us assume our own existence was somehow inevitable. It really was not. It was closer to a coin landing on its edge over and over for thousands of years in a row, without ever once tipping the wrong way. We already stood together around one particular grave earlier tonight, and I mentioned the wagon and the animal and the ochre. What I did not fully get into yet is what that same grave and thousands like it, scattered across the same stretch of ground, tell us once you start comparing them side by side rather than looking at any single one in isolation. Some of these mounds are modest. A shallow pit, a body, maybe a single pot, nothing more. And then not far away, sitting in the same landscape built by the same broad culture, you find something else entirely. Mounds stretching nearly 100 meters across, requiring an almost unbelievable amount of coordinated labor to raise, containing a body surrounded by copper daggers, axes, complete wagons, the remains of sacrificed animals stacked in genuine abundance. A few of these larger mounds were not even built once and left alone. They were reopened again and again across multiple generations, each new burial dug in a little deeper or a little to the side of the last, almost like a family, steadily adding names to the same ever-expanding plot of ground. A handful of these elite grave sites go a step further, still marked above ground, with tall carved stone figures roughly human in shape, etched with belts, weapons, sometimes even individual fingers and faces. Nobody knows for certain whether these stones were meant to represent the specific man buried beneath them, an ancestor, or something closer to a guardian spirit standing watch over the mound. What is fairly hard to argue with is the intention behind them. Somebody wanted this particular grave noticed from a distance by anyone crossing that stretch of grassland for a very long time afterward. That is not the behavior of a culture without hierarchy. That is a culture actively advertising it. Think about that practice for a second, because there is something almost startlingly familiar buried inside it. A family reserving the same patch of earth for itself, generation after generation quietly announcing to everyone travelling past that this particular stretch of grassland, and the memory sitting inside it, belonged to them specifically, and had for longer than anyone currently alive could personally remember. Strip away the ochre and the wagons for a moment, and you're looking at something not so different from a family plot in an old cemetery, or a name carved above the door of a business that has quietly stayed in the same family for 4 generations. The details change. The underlying human impulse holding onto a claim through memory and repetition apparently does not. And here is a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, one I think is worth sitting with properly instead of skating past. This pattern was not evenly spread across the entire steppe world. Graves in the eastern reaches of Yamnaya territory tend to show noticeably richer grave goods, a higher proportion of male burials and rituals leaning even more heavily toward weapons and status than graves found farther west, closer to the edge of the farming world we spent time in earlier. It is almost as though the closer these communities sat to the open, contested heart of the steppe, the more sharply their hierarchies hardened, while families settled nearer the softer, more familiar edge of the farming world eased into something a touch less rigid. Whatever social structure was hardening out here, it was not one single uniform rule book, applied evenly across an entire civilization. It was closer to a shared set of instincts, interpreted somewhat differently depending on which particular stretch of grass a given family happened to call home. I think that nuance matters. It is tempting, especially in a video like this one, to flatten an entire culture spanning thousands of kilometers into one tidy single description. Real human societies almost never cooperate with that kind of tidiness then or now, so if wealth and standing were staying locked inside particular male lines, where exactly did that leave the women in this picture? This is where the story gets more interesting than the simple, slightly grim version most people assume by default. A little later in this broader story, in communities descended from these same steppe-connected populations, researchers studying burial grounds in the Lech River Valley, in what is now southern Germany, were able to trace entire households across several generations using nothing but DNA and careful excavation. What they found was a strikingly consistent pattern. Sons stayed. Land animals and status passed down cleanly through that same unbroken male line generation after generation, in exactly the fashion we have been describing. But almost every single woman buried in those same family plots had grown up somewhere else, entirely arriving from a different valley, a different community, sometimes a considerable distance away before marrying in, and eventually being laid to rest inside a family she had not been born into. Even more telling, researchers looking closely at those same farmsteads noticed something else. Alongside the wealthy family members buried with bronze and careful ceremony, a separate cluster of individuals turned up nearby with almost nothing at all, no clear genetic tie to the main family line, buried without much ceremony whatsoever. The most likely explanation, according to the people who studied them closely, is that these were labourers, perhaps even something resembling servants, or unfree workers living and working alongside a family they were never considered part of. Inequality, it turns out, was not just about who got the biggest grave. It could also mean simply being left almost entirely out of the record altogether. Here is where I want to offer you my own honest take on that detail rather than just reporting it and moving on. It would be easy sitting here comfortably thousands of years later to describe that pattern purely as a loss. Women uprooted, sent away from everything familiar, folded into someone else's household with little say in the matter, and for any individual woman actually living through it, that loss may well have been real and personal and difficult in exactly the way it sounds. But zoom out just slightly, and those same women were doing something that mattered enormously to the survival of these scattered, spread-out communities. They were the connective tissue holding an otherwise fragmented world together. Every single marriage crossing from one valley into another was also a quiet trade agreement, a peace treaty, an insurance policy against the kind of total isolation that eventually kills a small community stone dead. The men held the property. The women, whether anyone at the time framed it this way or not, were arguably holding the whole network together. Here is one more twist worth knowing because it complicates the story in exactly the way careful research usually does, and because I think honest storytelling means including the parts that do not fit as neatly as we might like. You would reasonably assume that the men who eventually carried steppe ancestry across the rest of Europe, the fathers and sons who show up in later cultures with names like corded ware, were direct descendants of the exact same paternal line we've been discussing tonight. The actual genetic picture turns out to be a little messier than that and honestly more interesting for it. Many of those later communities carry a different related branch of the male family tree, not a straight unbroken line traced back to the specific fathers buried in the earliest kurgans we've been talking about, but a cousin branch, so to speak, closely related, sharing the same deep roots without being quite the same single trunk. Whole populations hundreds of years and hundreds of kilometers removed from where this story started still carried enormous amounts of steppe ancestry passed down, mostly through the mothers blended in from multiple different related patrilineal groups along the way, rather than flowing cleanly and directly from one single ancestral household. So if you go looking one day for a single clean unbroken line running from a grave on that empty grassland straight down into your own family tree, you will probably come up empty. What you will actually find, if the science is right, is something a little messier, and I think honestly a little more moving. Not one story, a whole tangle of closely related stories constantly crossing, blending, and quietly reinforcing each other, until the entire pattern became impossible to fully untangle again. Think of it less like a single river running in a straight line from one grave to your own front door, and more like an entire river delta. Dozens of channels branching, merging and branching again, all of them ultimately carrying water that started in roughly the same distant mountains, and that tangle, once it started moving west into new territory, did something rather dramatic to the populations it eventually reached. Researchers studying the male family lines carried by later steppe-descended cultures have documented what amounts to a genuine bottleneck, a sudden sharp narrowing in the overall diversity of paternal lineages occurring in two separate waves, one closer to 2600 years before the Common Era, another closer to 2400. In plain terms, huge numbers of previously distinct paternal family lines simply stop appearing in the record at almost exactly the same moment, replaced by a comparatively small handful of lines that went on to father an outsized share of everyone who came afterward. Try picturing that for a second in more familiar terms. Imagine an entire region where within the space of only a few generations the vast majority of grandfathers turn out to share the very same small handful of last names, while dozens of other family names that existed only shortly before simply stop showing up in any record at all. That is roughly the scale of what the genetic evidence is describing here quietly inside teeth and bone fragments, thousands of years after the fact. Here's a question worth sitting with, especially if you have ever idly clicked through one of those online ancestry reports yourself. When a report tells you that a huge percentage of your background traces back to one particular region, have you ever wondered how much of that was really about population size and how much of it was really about a handful of unusually successful, unusually stubborn family lines, quietly outcompeting all their neighbours, generation after generation, until almost nothing else was left standing beside them? I will be honest with you about something else sitting here thinking it through out loud tonight. Stories like this one make for excellent drama, and I have absolutely leaned into that drama a little myself over the last few minutes. But underneath the drama sits a slightly less flattering, more human truth. Every hierarchy eventually produces losers as well as winners. For every enormous kurgan holding a man surrounded by daggers and a full wagon, there were almost certainly dozens of smaller, quieter families whose stories simply did not survive to leave much of a trace behind at all. No rich grave, no lasting line, no name anyone remembers. History as usually told tends to follow the kurgans. It rarely spends much time with the shallow pits sitting quietly beside them. None of this stayed contained tidily out on the open steppe. A society organized this cleanly around inherited male property, backed by herds that could be grown, multiplied, and eventually defended by force, if it came to that, was never going to stay in one place indefinitely. Hungry for fresh grass, competitive by nature, and increasingly practiced at moving fast and light, families like these were always going to keep pushing outward toward whatever open ground happened to sit just past the horizon. And right next door in those painted river towns and gold-laden coastal settlements we spent real time inside earlier tonight, something else, something none of those farming families could have possibly seen coming, was already quietly beginning to unravel, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with wagons or fathers or inheritance at all. the soil itself, the rivers, the very ground those towns had trusted for 2,000 years, was starting to turn against them slowly at first, in ways no single person standing in those painted rooms could have named out loud, even if they had somehow felt it coming. Soil does not announce itself. It does not send a warning or ring a bell, or give a farming family any obvious sign that the ground beneath their feet has quietly stopped forgiving them the way it once did. It just slowly gives a little less back each season, a slightly smaller harvest, a slightly hungrier winter, until one particular year the difference finally becomes impossible to ignore, and nobody standing in that field, watching the grain come in thinner than their parents ever remembered, it fully understands why. That is roughly where we need to sit for a little while tonight, inside a genuine mystery, one that professional archaeologists still argue about, sometimes rather heatedly at conferences to this day. I imagine there are entire academic dinners that have been quietly ruined over exactly this question. Because the painted river towns and gold-heavy coastal settlements we spent real time inside earlier did not last forever. Something ended that world. And here is the honest, slightly less satisfying truth before we go any further. Nobody has a single tidy answer for exactly what that something was. I want to deal with the popular version of this story first, mostly so we can set it aside properly. If you have ever come across a documentary or a book, or frankly another video very much like this one, there is a decent chance you have heard some version of the following. A peaceful, sophisticated farming world rich in gold and painted pottery gets overrun by warlike horsemen sweeping in from the eastern grasslands, and an entire golden age simply gets trampled underfoot. It is a fantastic story. It has a clear villain, a clear victim, and a clean, satisfying shape. It is also based on the actual dates involved, almost certainly wrong, at least for a large piece of this puzzle. Here is the detail that quietly demolishes that version of events. The wealthiest, most dazzling stretch of that farming world, the gold-laden coastal cemetery we spent time with earlier, had already gone silent by somewhere around 6,000 years ago. Full stop. Ended. And the culture we have been calling the Yamnaya, the herding families who eventually did spread west into Europe, did not even exist yet as a distinct recognizable group. Their story really only gets underway several centuries later. That gap alone, several hundred years of empty calendar sitting between one supposed villain and one supposed crime, is the kind of detail that should make anyone pause before repeating the tidy version out loud again. One respected archaeologist reviewing this exact timeline some years back pointed out the obvious awkwardness rather bluntly. If you want to blame a steppe invasion for ending that coastal civilization, you have to somehow explain away several centuries sitting empty in between, along with an entire enormous farming world farther north that was, if anything, just getting started around the very same time the coastal settlements were already falling quiet. So can I ask you something before we go further into what actually might have happened? Why do you think the invasion story took hold so firmly in the popular imagination anyway, when the timeline never really supported it? My own honest suspicion is that it is simply a more satisfying shape for a story to take. Human beings like villains. We like a single identifiable cause we can point toward and say there, that is what went wrong. A slow, boring, multi-decade shift in rainfall patterns does not make for nearly as gripping a tale as horsemen sweeping over the horizon, even when the boring version happens to be closer to what the evidence actually supports. Somewhere, a documentary producer decided that decades of complicated Bayesian radiocarbon modelling was never going to sell as many advertisements as a dramatic reenactment involving spears, and honestly, it is hard to blame them for the choice, even while gently correcting it here tonight. What the evidence does support, at least for that particular coastal world, looks considerably quieter and considerably sadder in its own way. No burned settlements at a large scale, no mass graves full of violence, no scattered weapons telling a story of raiders sweeping through in the night. Just a slow, patchy pulling back, fewer graves being dug each generation, fewer new gold ornaments turning up in the archaeological layers, the elaborate painted pottery growing simpler and less common with each passing decade, until eventually people simply were not gathering in that particular place anymore. Most researchers now lean toward a shift in climate, a stretch of years growing cooler and noticeably less reliable for the kind of farming that world depended on pushing communities to scatter thin out and eventually abandon settlements that had stood for well over 1,000 years. Imagine watching your own hometown slowly empty out over 3 or 4 generations, not because of any single dramatic event, just because the harvest kept getting a little worse and a little worse again until enough families had quietly moved on that the whole place stopped feeling like anywhere worth staying. There is a particular kind of grief in that version of an ending, one that never gets a clean date attached to it. No single afternoon anyone could point to and say, that is when everything changed. Just an accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays, each one slightly emptier than the last, until one day the emptiness is simply all that is left. Now the enormous river valley towns we spent time inside, earlier the ones covering hundreds of hectares and housing thousands of people, followed a somewhat different and honestly more interesting timeline. These particular towns lasted centuries longer than that coastal world, and their ending overlapped at least loosely with the earlier stirrings of herding families out on the open steppe. But even here the picture researchers have pieced together looks far more tangled than any simple invasion story would suggest. Excavations across dozens of the smaller villages connected to this same farming world tell a remarkably calm story, once you actually go looking at the evidence instead of assuming the drama. Most of these smaller settlements stayed occupied for something like 1 or 2 centuries before quietly relocating a short distance away, once the local soil had clearly had enough. No ash layers from a hostile fire. No skeletons left where they fell in a hurry, just an orderly familiar kind of packing up and moving on the same practical instinct that had apparently been part of this culture's rhythm from the very beginning, back when entire towns still burned their own homes down on purpose and rebuilt nearby. Whatever finally brought this world to an end, it does not look from where the evidence currently stands like anybody kicked down the door. Some of the pressure was environmental in a slow, grinding, unglamorous way. Centuries of clearing forests to make room for fields had gradually pushed the tree line back by what researchers studying old pollen samples estimate at somewhere between 30 and 40 miles in some regions, and soil that gets farmed hard enough for long enough without real rest eventually gives less back, no matter how skilled the people working it happen to be. Even careful farmers who let their fields lie fallow every few years, giving the ground time to recover, could only hold that decline off for so long once tens of thousands of people were leaning on the same stretch of soil at once. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, especially if you have ever found yourself anxious about the weather patterns in your own lifetime. Do you think a slow, multi-generational shift like that one would have even registered as a crisis to the people living through it? Or would it have simply felt like ordinary bad luck? One difficult year rolling into the next, never quite obvious enough in the moment to be recognized as the actual ending of an entire world. Some of the pressure, and this is the part I personally find far more interesting than any climate chart, appears to have come from somewhere far closer to home. Do you remember that fairness we talked about earlier? The sense that these massive settlements had been deliberately organized to keep any single family from towering too far above its neighbors. Researchers who have spent years carefully measuring house sizes across dozens of these settlements have found something rather striking hiding inside that data. One recent study alone worked through nearly 7,000 individual houses spread across nearly 40 different sites, essentially building a kind of ancient economic report card for the entire region. For a good while that fairness held. Homes stayed remarkably similar in size to one another, generation after generation, exactly the levelling pattern we noticed before. But given enough time in settlement after settlement, that pattern slowly starts to break down. A handful of homes start growing noticeably larger than their neighbours. Differences that had quietly stayed suppressed for a long while start creeping back to the surface. And not long after that particular shift shows up in the data, many of these same settlements begin thinning out and eventually emptying entirely. I do not think that timing is a coincidence, and I doubt I am the only person who has noticed it. A society that had apparently found some clever, deliberate way to hold inequality at bay for generations inside communities of 10 or 15,000 people eventually lost its grip on that balance. Whatever informal rules, whatever quiet social pressure, whatever shared expectation had kept ambition roughly in check, for so long it apparently could not hold forever, any more than similar arrangements managed to hold forever in far more recent history. And once that balance slipped, the very thing that had allowed so many people to remain crowded together peacefully for so long may have simply stopped working the way it once had. There is one more thread tangled into this particular mystery, and it is honestly one of the stranger pieces of research to come out of this entire field in recent years. Scientists studying ancient remains from across this broad stretch of time, farmers-herders, communities scattered from Scandinavia down through Central Europe, have managed to pull an early primitive strain of the plague bacterium directly out of teeth belonging to people who died roughly 5,000 years ago. The exact same family of bacteria responsible thousands of years later for the Black Death. This particular ancient strain worked differently than the version most of us have heard about from medieval history. It appears to have been missing a few of the genetic tools that later allowed the disease to spread efficiently through fleas riding on rats, which was the method behind so much of the devastation centuries afterward. Which means this earlier version most likely spread some other way through direct contact between people, perhaps, or quietly carried along the same trade routes that were already moving shells and copper and painted pottery across enormous distances, the very same networks of trust and exchange we talked about earlier tonight. Some researchers studying this evidence have proposed something quietly unsettling. That the connections which had allowed this farming world to flourish for 2,000 years, the trade, the shared festivals, the marriages crossing between distant towns, may have also been the exact channels that eventually carried something far less welcome from one community into the next. Think back to those Mediterranean shells we talked about earlier, passed hand to hand across hundreds of miles, by people who trusted each other enough to keep the exchange going for centuries. A network built entirely on trust and contact is a wonderful thing right up until the moment something dangerous learns to travel along exactly the same route. I want to be careful here because I think honest storytelling means resisting the urge to hand you one single dramatic villain, when the actual research simply does not support that. Nobody can currently prove that plague alone brought down these settlements. It remains one candidate among several sitting alongside climate, alongside soil exhaustion, alongside that slow unravelling of internal fairness we just talked about. My honest opinion, for whatever it is worth from someone who has spent a lot of hours reading through all of this, is that it was probably not one single thing at all. It rarely is. Difficult years compound on top of each other. A run of poor harvests makes a community more vulnerable to disease. A disease outbreak weakens exactly the kind of cooperation that had been holding inequality in check. Inequality creeping back in makes it harder for a stressed community to pull together and solve any of the other problems stacking up around it. Everything simply leans on everything else quietly until the whole structure gives way at once. I think about this pattern more often than you might expect, honestly, whenever I come across any large complicated system under strain, not just an ancient one. Rarely does a company collapse or a marriage end or a community fall apart because of exactly one clean, identifiable cause. Usually it is 3 or 4 ordinary pressures, each one survivable on its own, arriving at roughly the same time and quietly reinforcing each other until the whole thing simply cannot hold anymore. Old Europe, for all its painted pottery and gold and 2,000 years of quiet continuity, may have simply run into the same unglamorous math that eventually catches up with almost everything human beings ever build, none of which means outside newcomers played no role whatsoever in what came next. It only means the popular version of the story cause and effect arrows sweeping cleanly out of the east has the order badly scrambled. This world was not thriving, and then suddenly destroyed. It was already unsteady on its feet for reasons that had almost nothing to do with anyone arriving from the grasslands by the time new families really did start showing up in meaningful numbers, looking for fresh pasture, fresh opportunity and land that increasingly nobody seemed quite able to hold on to, the way earlier generations once had. And that raises a question worth sitting with as we head into what comes next tonight. If these herding families were not in fact sweeping across the landscape on horseback, the way almost every documentary and dramatization loves to show them, then how exactly were they managing to move so far so fast into a world that was already quietly coming apart at the seams on its own? The honest answer turns out to be considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than the image most of us have been carrying around in our heads without ever really questioning it, and it starts with an animal that almost everyone gets wrong. Shut your eyes for a second if you're somewhere safe enough to do that and picture the image most of us already carry around for this exact moment in history. A line of riders on the horizon, low sun behind them, manes and hair whipping sideways in the same direction, thundering down off the grassland toward a farming village that never stood a chance. Dust rising behind them in one long unbroken cloud, spears catching the last orange light of the day. It is the cover art on half the books ever written about this period. It is the establishing shot in almost every documentary, the loading screen on more than one strategy game you have probably played yourself. It might honestly be the picture sitting in your head right now from the very first time I mentioned the word steppe tonight. I need to gently take that picture apart for you piece by piece, because the actual science behind it turns out to be far stranger, and honestly far more interesting than the movie version we've all absorbed without ever really questioning it. Let's start with a truly strange twist in this story, one that even caught professional archaeologists off guard fairly recently. For a long while, the leading candidate for the very first domesticated horses anywhere on Earth was not the Yamnaya at all. It was a different community entirely called the Butai culture, living out on the Kazakh steppe farther east around the same broad stretch of time we've been discussing tonight. Researchers digging through Butai settlements found remarkably convincing, evidence-worn patterns on horse teeth, consistent with a bit the kind of thing you would only expect from an animal being ridden or driven along with the chemical residue of horse milk, baked directly into the walls of ancient pottery. For years this looked like the clear, tidy answer. Horses got domesticated on the Kazakh steppe, and everything that followed the migrations, the eventual cavalry cultures of later history, could trace itself back to that one moment. Then geneticists actually sequenced the DNA from those Butai horses, and the tidy answer fell apart completely. It turns out those particular horses are not the ancestors of a single domestic horse alive on this planet today. Not one. They are instead the ancestors of a small, stocky wild horse called the Przewalski's horse, an animal that still exists, still runs wild across parts of Central Asia today, and has never at any point in its history actually been tamed by anyone. The bitware was real. The milk residue was real. Somebody out on that stretch of Kazakh grassland truly had figured out how to manage and milk these particular animals generations before anyone on the Black and Caspian Steppe was doing anything similar. It simply was not the beginning of the story everybody assumed it was. It was closer to an entirely separate experiment running in parallel that quietly failed to pass its results down to any future generation of horses at all. Picture spending years convinced you had found the founding population of every horse alive today, only to discover you had actually found the ancestors of a completely separate, still wild species that simply happened to share the same general neighborhood. That is not a small correction. That is closer to searching for your own great-great-grandmother finding a grave with the right name on it, in roughly the right town, feeling entirely certain you had solved the puzzle, and then running a test that reveals you've just been paying your respects to a complete stranger the entire time, someone who happened to share a name and a hometown and nothing else whatsoever. So if the first real domestication attempt on record turned out to be a genetic dead end, where did every horse alive today actually come from? This is where the story gets, if anything, even stranger, and where it directly collides with the version most people already believe about the Yamnaya specifically. A team of researchers sequenced genetic material from more than 250 ancient horses scattered across a huge stretch of territory, and finally managed to pin down the true origin point of every modern domestic horse breed alive on the planet today, from a farm pony to a racehorse to whatever might be pulling a cart through a market square somewhere this very evening. That origin sits in the lower reaches of the Volga, and Don River's the same broad region where quite a lot of tonight's story has already been unfolding. Sounds like it lines up perfectly with the Yamnaya after all, right? Up until you look closely at the actual dates involved. This particular breed of horse, the one every single domestic horse today ultimately descends from, only really began spreading outward and replacing every other horse population across the continent, starting around 4,000 years ago, roughly 2,000 years before this current moment. Researchers studying that same genetic data notice something else worth mentioning here, because I think it is a small detail that makes the whole discovery feel a little more tangible. Two particular genes stood out as having been under intense deliberate selection in this specific bloodline, one connected to back strength and stamina, the other tied to calmer, more manageable behavior around people. In other words, the horses that eventually won out over every competing bloodline on the planet were not simply the fastest or the strongest. They were in a very real, measurable sense the ones that could actually put up with us. Compare that to the original Yamnaya expansion into Europe, which the previous part of tonight's story placed considerably earlier, closer to 5,000 years ago. There is a real meaningful gap sitting between those two numbers, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 years. Think about how much can shift culturally in 1,000 years, roughly the same distance separating our own present moment from medieval knights on horseback. Whatever those earliest herding families were riding on quite literally into the heart of Europe, it was mostly wooden wheels and a diet built on dairy, not the specific patient generations-long breeding project that eventually produced a horse reliable enough to build an entire mounted culture around. The researchers behind this particular study were admirably direct about what that gap actually means. Their own words translated into plain language essentially reject the popular idea that horseback riding was the engine driving that original dramatic Yamnaya expansion into Europe. The specific breed of horse capable of reliably carrying a rider across long distances simply was not fully in existence yet, at the moment this story's earlier chapters were unfolding. Can I ask you something here, because I think it says a lot about how we absorb history in the first place? Does it surprise you at all that an idea, this specific an idea with an actual identifiable moment where the genetics simply do not support it, still ended up as the default mental image almost everyone carries around? I do not think that is really anybody's fault, if I am honest. Nobody sets out to believe something inaccurate on purpose. It is simply that a mounted warrior makes for a far more compelling illustration than a family plodding along beside an ox pulling a wooden cart, so the mounted warrior is the one that ended up on the book covers and the video game box art and eventually inside all of our heads. Think about how many different pieces of media had to independently make that same visual choice for it to feel this permanently lodged in our collective imagination. Museum dioramas built for school field trips, history documentaries needing a dramatic thumbnail, illustrators working from earlier illustrators who were themselves working from even earlier illustrators, each one making the exact same reasonable artistic decision right up until an entire chain of otherwise careful, well-meaning people had quietly baked a scientific inaccuracy directly into the public imagination, without a single one of them intending to mislead anybody at all. Now, before you assume horses played no role whatsoever in this story, let me complicate things one more time, because the actual research refuses to sit still and hand us a clean single answer, the same way it refused to hand us one back when we were talking about why an entire farming civilization eventually faded out. We already know from earlier tonight that horse milk occasionally shows up alongside cattle and sheep milk in the residue scraped from Yamnaya teeth. So horses were clearly present, clearly valued, clearly woven into daily life well before any of this riding evidence enters the picture. The animal itself was never a stranger to these families. What took considerably longer to arrive was the specific specialized relationship human and horse, moving together as a single working unit that later cultures would eventually build an entire way of life around. A separate team of researchers examining actual human skeletons from Yamnaya graves, dated across roughly the same window as the earliest migrations, somewhere between 5,000 and 4,500 years ago, found something rather striking hiding in the bones themselves. Subtle changes in the hip sockets, particular wear patterns along the lower spine and thigh bones, the exact kind of skeletal signature you would expect to see in someone who spent a significant portion of their life sitting astride an animal legs, gripping its sides for balance hour after hour, year after year. 5 separate individuals found across 3 different countries, all showing this same pattern. Researchers studying these particular skeletons now consider them among the oldest confirmed human riders discovered anywhere in the world. Here's a small question worth turning over for a moment. If you have ever ridden a horse yourself, even just once on some holiday trail ride you barely remember, do you recall how strange and unnatural it felt for those first few minutes before your body figured out how to move with the animal instead of fighting against it? Now imagine being one of the very first human beings anywhere on the planet to attempt that, with absolutely nobody to teach you, no saddle, no stirrup, no older cousin, shouting instructions from the ground. Just you, an animal considerably larger and stronger than yourself, and a great deal of trial error, and presumably several undignified landings in the dirt. So here is where this story actually lands, and I think it is a far more honest, far more human place to land than either extreme version. Full-scale mounted cavalry and organized culture built entirely around galloping warriors almost certainly did not exist yet during the earliest waves of migration we have been following tonight. That particular chapter belongs to a later period, once the true riding-capable bloodline of the horse had spread widely enough, once the equipment and the breeding and the generational habit of climbing onto an animal's back had all caught up with each other properly. It is also worth saying plainly that even where this early riding was happening, there is no solid evidence it had yet spread as a habit across the wider Yamnaya world all at once. It looks from what survives more like an early scattered skill practiced here and there by particular individuals in particular places, rather than a shared cultural standard every family out on that grassland had already adopted. But scattered occasional riding an individual family member, climbing onto the back of a particularly cooperative animal to check on a herd scattered across open ground or to cover distance a little faster than walking allowed that appears to have already been happening quietly right from very early on. I find that version considerably more moving than the cinematic one, honestly, if you give it a real chance. Not an army sweeping the horizon on command. A single rider alone, probably a little nervous the first handful of times figuring out balance and grip, through nothing but trial and repeated error decades before anybody had worked out a proper saddle or reliable reins or any of the equipment we now take completely for granted. Somebody had to be the very first person on this entire planet to trust an animal enough to sit on top of it and let it carry them somewhere. I think about that occasionally, and it strikes me as one of the more quietly courageous moments buried inside this whole story, the kind that never makes it onto a book cover because there is nothing dramatic to actually paint. Think about the sheer, ordinary bravery required for that first attempt stripped of every bit of romance we usually pile on top of it. No instructor, no idea whether the animal would panic or bolt or simply refuse outright. Just a person standing beside a creature roughly 10 times their own weight, deciding that today was the day they were going to find out what happened if they climbed on anyway. Somewhere between reckless and quietly heroic, and probably a fair amount of both at once. There is something almost comedic in a very dry, very human way about how badly this particular myth has aged. An entire industry of documentaries, feature films, and beautifully rendered strategy games has spent decades building elaborate cavalry charges out of a moment in history that mostly involved oxen patience and a slowly perfected recipe for fermented milk. If a filmmaker ever asked me to storyboard this accurately, the most dramatic shot available would probably be somebody successfully balancing on a nervous, unbroken horse for the very first time without immediately landing face down in the grass. Riveting cinema, I am sure. Somewhere a marketing department is quietly grateful that nobody consulted the actual archaeological record before designing that particular game cover, so if it was not really a mounted invasion sweeping across the landscape, what actually happened when these herding families moving mostly on foot, and by wagon, some of them occasionally on horseback, finally reached the settled farming world we spent time inside a little earlier tonight? What did that meeting actually look like on the ground, generation after generation, family by family, without a single dramatic charge to mark the occasion? And more importantly, what did it leave behind permanently inside the bodies of everyone who came after, long after the wagons had rotted away and the last of the original travellers had been laid to rest under mounds of their own? Because this next part of the story is not really about wagons or horses or migration routes at all anymore, it is about something considerably smaller and considerably more permanent, hiding inside a single strand of molecule that every one of us happens to be carrying around right now, in absolutely every cell in our body. There is a particular kind of scientific moment that almost never gets the attention it deserves, one where two separate teams of researchers working independently on different continents using different laboratories and different sets of ancient bones, somehow land on the exact same explosive conclusion within days of each other. That is precisely what happened in the early summer of 2015, and I think it deserves a proper telling because most people watching tonight have almost certainly never heard the actual story behind one of the biggest discoveries in the entire history of this field, one that quietly rewrote an argument archaeologists had been having with each other for the better part of 100 years. Picture two research groups, one built around a team in Germany and the United States, the other centered in Denmark and Australia, both quietly spending months, in some cases years, extracting fragile genetic material out of bones that had been sitting in the ground for thousands of years. Both teams were racing against the same brutal technical problem. Ancient DNA degrades badly over that kind of time span, chopped into tiny damaged fragments that are notoriously difficult to piece back together into anything usable. If you're picturing something glamorous here, adventurers in wide-brimmed hats prying open a tomb, I'm sorry to disappoint you. The actual work looks like exhausted graduate students in white coats, pipetting tiny amounts of liquid for hours on end inside a room, kept colder than most people's refrigerators, which is, if we are being honest, a far less cinematic image than the one Hollywood generally prefers to sell us. Neither group was working in secret exactly, but neither one fully realized just how closely their conclusions were about to line up. When both papers finally landed, published within the very same stretch of days inside the same prestigious scientific journal, the effect on the field was somewhere between a thunderclap and a full identity crisis. Two entirely separate investigations using different samples pulled from different parts of Europe had arrived at the same jaw-dropping answer completely on their own. Scientists describing that particular week later admitted it felt less like publishing a discovery and more like watching two witnesses questioned in separate rooms with no way of coordinating their stories, somehow described the exact same crime scene down to identical details. For a field that usually moves at the careful, unhurried pace of committee meetings and peer review, that particular week apparently felt closer to a plot twist nobody had scripted in advance. So let's talk about what that answer actually was, because I do not think a summary really does it justice until you sit with the specific numbers involved. Researchers focused their attention on skeletons belonging to a culture we touched on briefly a little earlier tonight. The corded ware people, named for the twisted cord patterns pressed into their pottery, who show up across an enormous stretch of Central and Northern Europe starting nearly 4,700 years ago. When scientists compared the genetic makeup of these corded ware individuals against both the earlier farming population native to that same region and the herding families we've been following out on the steppe, the results were almost impossible to explain any other way. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/4 of the genetic material carried by these corded ware skeletons traced directly back to the steppe. Not a small trace. Not a faint echo passed down over dozens of generations. 3 out of every 4 ancestors, roughly speaking, tracing back to people who had been living an entirely different life in an entirely different place, only a handful of generations earlier. Try holding that fraction in your head properly for a moment, because I think it is easy to let a percentage like that slide past without actually feeling the weight of it. Picture your own great-grandparents, all 8 of them, if you happen to know anything about your family that far back. Now imagine that 6 of those 8 people were not from anywhere near where you grew up at all, but had arrived within living memory from somewhere on the far side of a continent, speaking a different language, eating different food, burying their dead in a completely different way. That is roughly the scale of demographic change we're actually talking about here, not spread comfortably across 1,000 quiet years, but compressed into something closer to 2 or 3 centuries. All of it happening with no writing, no maps, and no way for anyone living through it to fully grasp the size of what was unfolding around them. Here is a detail from this same research that I think gets skipped over far too quickly, and it might be the single most quietly revealing number in this entire story. Scientists studying a particular stretch of the genome that only travels through fathers notice something strange sitting alongside all of that steppe ancestry. Judging by the pattern left behind, it looks as though something like 4 to 15 men arrive from the steppe for every single woman who made that same journey. Sit with that ratio for a second, because it raises an uncomfortable, honestly unavoidable question. If the men were arriving from the steppe in such lopsided numbers, who exactly were they starting families with once they got there? Have you ever noticed how almost every retelling of a big historical migration somehow forgets to ask that particular question? Armies get counted, wagons get counted. Somehow the actual mechanics of who ended up married to whom and under what circumstances rarely make it into the more heroic version of the story, even though it might be the single most consequential detail of all for anyone hoping to trace their own family tree back through it. I want to be careful and honest with you about this part, because there is no single comfortable answer sitting at the bottom of it, and I think pretending otherwise would be a disservice to you and to the actual people this happened to. Some of those unions were almost certainly welcomed women from farming communities marrying into newly arrived herding families the way people have always found each other across cultural lines, through curiosity, through opportunity, sometimes through simple affection. Some of it, researchers studying the skeletal and archaeological record suspect, was almost certainly not welcomed at all. A dramatic male-heavy migration, arriving inside a world already unsteady on its feet. For all the reasons we spent time with a little earlier tonight, is not a recipe that tends to produce a uniformly gentle story. I am not going to pretend I know the exact balance between those two possibilities for every single family involved, because nobody alive today actually can. What the numbers do tell us fairly plainly is that whatever combination of romance negotiation and outright coercion was involved, the local men themselves largely vanish from the genetic record within a handful of generations, while the women's lineages persist quietly alongside the newcomers. Now here is where this story connects to something considerably larger than any single ancient culture, and I think it is worth pausing on because it says something about how science itself sometimes has to fight its way back to an uncomfortable truth. For a great deal of the last century, the specific idea we have just been describing, a real physical migration out of the steppe, reshaping the population of an entire continent, was treated with genuine suspicion inside serious academic circles. Part of that caution was reasonable good scientific practice resisting a dramatic claim without solid proof, since dramatic claims about ancient migrations have a long, embarrassing history of turning out to be wrong once someone actually checks the evidence properly. But part of it, and I think this deserves to be said plainly, rather than tiptoed around, came from the fact that cruder, far uglier versions of this exact migration idea had already been dragged through some of the darkest political propaganda of the 20th century, twisted into invented stories about a pure conquering bloodline sweeping down from the north, used to justify atrocities that still cast a shadow over how these questions get discussed even now. Understandably, an entire generation of careful, well-meaning researchers grew wary of any theory that sounded even remotely similar, and leaned instead towards safer explanations involving ideas and pottery styles, quietly spreading from one settled community to its neighbour without anybody actually having to pack up and move anywhere at all. For decades suggesting a real migration had happened, here was almost enough to end an academic career guilt by association with an idea nobody reasonable actually wanted to be caught defending, What actually turned up in that ancient DNA once the technology finally existed to decode it properly is almost the exact opposite of what those old poisonous stories claimed. Not a single pure bloodline marching triumphantly into history. A messy, complicated, thoroughly mixed population built from farmers and hunters and herders and steppe families all blending together, sometimes gently, and sometimes not over and over again for thousands of years, until untangling any one thread from any other became nearly impossible. If anything, real hard science ended up quietly demolishing the fantasy of a pure ancestral bloodline, far more effectively than decades of polite academic caution ever managed to. The truth, once the data actually spoke, turned out to be migration. Yes, exactly as some had long suspected, but migration into an endlessly blended, endlessly complicated human story, not the clean, terrible fiction certain people once tried to build on top of it. Historians and geneticists studying this particular moment sometimes reach for an image involving water, and I think it earns the comparison honestly, rather than for the sake of drama. The earlier movement of steppe families we followed a little earlier tonight behaved more like a slow tide one wagon, one family, one generation, folding gently into the next community over decade after decade. What happened here arriving in Central and Northern Europe within those same few centuries behaves far more like a wave that had been quietly building strength far out at sea, gathering size and speed somewhere nobody nearby could see it coming, before finally arriving all at once and reshaping the entire coastline in a single dramatic pulse. Everything that came before had been preparation. This was the moment the actual water arrived. Let's bring this back down to something a little closer to your own evening, because I think the abstract version of this story only really lands once you connect it to something personal. That same steppe ancestry we've been tracing all night does not stop at the edge of some ancient graveyard. Researchers estimate that people living across modern Central and Northern Europe today carry somewhere between 40 and 50% of their overall genetic ancestry from this same steppe population, sitting right alongside older ancestry from the very first farmers and older still from hunter-gatherers who were walking through these same forests long before anyone had planted a single seed on purpose. Farther south toward the Mediterranean, that same steppe contribution tends to thin out considerably, which is exactly why a map of this particular ancestry laid over a map of modern Europe produces a gradient rather than a hard border, fading gradually from north to south the way a stain slowly loses its colour the farther it spreads from where it was first spilled. Nobody drew a line on a chart and decided where the ancestry would stop. Geography, distance, and however many generations it took each new family to travel one valley farther quietly did all of that deciding on their own. Here's a question worth turning over in your own head for a moment, especially if you already know a little about your own background. If someone asked you right now to name the single group of people you most strongly identify with, based on where your family is from, would it even occur to you that the honest answer involves at least 3, and probably more completely different ancient populations, none of whom ever met each other willingly until circumstances sometimes gentle and sometimes brutal forced the introduction? I will admit something to you here, sitting with all of this for as long as I have now while putting tonight's story together. There is a strange kind of comfort hiding inside a number like 75% once you actually let yourself sit with it, instead of just reading it as a statistic. It means the whole tidy idea of a fixed, unchanging people, rooted forever in one particular patch of ground, was never really true for almost anybody currently walking around this planet. We're all, every single one of us, standing on top of several previous endings. Somebody's entire world quietly closed so that a new one containing eventually you could open in its place. I find that strangely reassuring rather than unsettling, if I'm honest with you. It means whatever feels permanent and unshakable about your own life right now is, historically speaking, just one more layer and layers. If this entire story has taught me anything, have a way of eventually settling into something new rather than simply disappearing. None of this happened in silence either, and that is really the piece of the story we still have not properly touched on tonight. Because a population this large, moving this far, carrying an entirely different way of naming the world around them, did not just leave a genetic signature buried in bone and teeth. They left something considerably harder to dig up with a trowel, something that still comes out of your own mouth every single time you speak a single word to another person, whether you have ever thought about where that word originally came from or not. Somewhere between 3 and 4 billion people alive on this planet right now, depending on how generously you draw the borders, speak a language that traces its roots back to whatever these families were speaking as they crossed that grassland with their wagons and their herds. English happens to be one of them, which means every single word I'm using to tell you this story tonight is itself a kind of living fossil, a piece of steppe ancestry riding around inside your own mouth every time you use it, whether you ever noticed it there or not. Let's talk about a courtroom in Calcutta, of all places sometime in the middle of the 1780s, because it might be the strangest starting point for tonight's story so far, and I mean that as a genuine compliment to how strange this particular chapter gets. A British judge named William Jones had taken up a post there, spending his days settling legal disputes under a colonial administration, and his evenings, by every account, buried in books rather than out at whatever passed for polite society at the time. Rather than simply enjoying whatever leisure a colonial judge might have claimed for himself, he threw himself into studying Sanskrit, the ancient sacred language of India, working through old religious and legal texts late into the night by candlelight the way a person only does when a subject has truly gotten its hooks into them. And somewhere in the middle of that studying, something started nagging at him. Sanskrit words for basic everyday concepts kept looking oddly, uncannily similar to words he already knew from Latin and Greek languages. He had studied as a younger man on a completely different continent, among a completely different set of people, with, as far as anybody at the time understood, no plausible historical connection between the two worlds whatsoever. He eventually stood up in front of a room full of scholars and made an argument that sounded at the time almost outrageous. These languages could not possibly resemble each other this closely by pure accident. Somewhere in the deep past, he proposed all of them must have descended from one single older language, a language so old that nobody speaking any of its descendants had the faintest memory it had ever existed at all. I want you to sit with how bold that claim actually was for a moment, because it is easy to nod along with it now sitting comfortably on this side of over 2 centuries of linguistics research. Imagine standing up in a room full of your intellectual peers and announcing that the sacred language of India and the language of ancient Rome were in some very real sense cousins. People in that room had spent entire careers assuming these civilizations had arisen completely independently of one another. Jones was essentially telling a room full of experts that an invisible thread connected people separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, based on nothing more than careful listening and a stubborn refusal to accept coincidence as an explanation. Here's a small taste of exactly the kind of pattern that convinced him, because I think it lands better with a real example than with an abstract description. The word for mother in Sanskrit sounds remarkably similar to the word for mother in Latin, which sounds remarkably similar to the word most of you watching tonight actually grew up saying yourselves. The same holds for father and for brother, drifting only slightly from language to language the way a single melody still sounds recognizable even after being passed through several different instruments. count from 1 to 3 in English, then in German, then in Spanish, then in Hindi, and pay attention to how the words for 3 in particular keep echoing the exact same basic shape over and over, language after language, continent after continent. That is not the kind of coincidence languages produce by accident. Coincidence gives you the occasional matching word here and there. It does not give you entire families of matching grammar, matching numbers, matching kinship terms, repeated with this much consistency across a landmass this enormous. So if all of these languages really did share one single ancestor, an obvious question follows immediately, and it happens to be a question that took considerably longer to answer than the original discovery itself. Where was that ancestor language actually spoken, and when? For the better part of 2 centuries afterward, this question turned into one of the longest-running arguments in the entire field of linguistics, and it eventually split serious researchers into 2 competing camps, each one building a truly compelling case, neither one able to fully settle the debate on its own. One camp associated for a long while with an archaeologist we've already spent some time with tonight argued that this mother language must have originated somewhere out on the Black Caspian Steppe, spreading outward alongside the herding families and wagons we've been following all evening sometime around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Her original version of this idea developed decades before ancient DNA existed. As a research tool at all, was built almost entirely on pottery styles, burial customs, and sheer scholarly intuition, and for a long while it was treated with a fair amount of polite academic skepticism, the kind reserved for a theory that sounds compelling at a dinner party, but lacks the hard proof to survive a real argument. The other camp, championed by a British archaeologist working several decades later, argued instead that the mother language travelled a completely different route, spreading much earlier alongside farming itself, all the way from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, closer to 9,000 years ago, carried gradually outward, not by wagons and warriors, but by ordinary families slowly planting fields farther and farther from where agriculture had first taken hold. This version had its own considerable strengths, a far more peaceful, far less dramatic mechanism of spread, and a timeline that fit tidily alongside everything else we already knew about how farming itself moved across the continent. Both theories had real evidence behind them. Both had truly serious, well-respected scholars defending them, and for a long stretch of the 20th century there was simply no reliable way to settle the argument, because you cannot carbon date a spoken sentence. Words do not leave a skeleton behind for anyone to dig up. What finally broke the deadlock, or at least tilted it decisively in one particular direction, turns out to be a wonderfully clever piece of detective work, one that has nothing to do with bones or genetics at all, and everything to do with reconstructing vocabulary, the way you might carefully reassemble a shattered pot from nothing but scattered fragments. Have you ever played that game where one person whispers a sentence around a circle, and by the time it reaches the last person, the words have twisted into something almost unrecognizable? Languages do something similar over thousands of years, drifting and reshaping themselves generation by generation. And yet remarkably certain words resist that drift far more stubbornly than others, particularly words tied to the most essential, most frequently repeated parts of daily life. Those are exactly the words linguists learn to go hunting for. Here is how the method actually works. If a particular word for something shows up in slightly altered form across nearly every single branch of this enormous language family, from the far western edge of Europe to the northern reaches of India, that strongly suggests the original mother language already had a word for that exact thing before the family ever split apart and scattered. And if a word does not show up that way, if it only appears in a handful of branches while being completely absent everywhere else, that suggests the concept came later invented or adopted separately after the split had already happened. Now apply that method to one particular cluster of words, and the whole debate suddenly gets a lot more interesting. Words for wheel, words for axle, words describing the act of carrying something rolling along the ground rather than dragging it. These words show up in recognizably related form across an enormous number of branches of this language family, stretching from one end of the distribution to the other. Which means, if the logic holds the people speaking, that original mother language already knew what a wheel was, already had a word for one before their descendants ever scattered far enough apart to lose contact with each other. Here's why that single detail matters so enormously. Archaeologists have a fairly solid, well-established date for when wheeled vehicles first show up anywhere in the physical record, and it sits considerably closer to the steppe timeline than to the much earlier farming timeline out of Anatolia. If the mother language already had a word for wheel baked into it, that mother language simply cannot be 9,000 years old, spreading gently alongside the earliest farmers, because wheels would not exist as a concept for thousands of years afterward. It has to be younger, considerably younger, young enough to fit comfortably alongside herding families, rolling wooden wagons across open grassland, rather than alongside farmers still centuries away from inventing the wheel at all. The same logic applies to reconstructed words for horse for wool, and for a particular kind of dairy product, very similar to something we already spent time discussing tonight, all of them showing up consistently enough across the language family to suggest they belong to the original vocabulary, and all of them fitting far more comfortably into a herding economy than a purely agricultural one. Can I be honest about how satisfying I personally find this particular piece of evidence? There is something almost poetic about an entire decades-long academic argument getting quietly settled by a single stubborn word, for wheel refusing to disappear no matter how far its speakers eventually wandered from each other. Bones can be misdated, pottery styles can spread through trade rather than migration. A word for wheel carried by families who truly needed that word every single day on the road turns out to be a far more honest witness than almost anything else this story has handed us so far tonight. And this is exactly where the story we spent time with a little earlier tonight quietly walks back into the room. Because the genetic evidence placing a massive population shift into Central Europe at roughly this same window of time was not simply a separate discovery happening to land nearby. It was independent confirmation arriving from an entirely different scientific discipline, using an entirely different kind of evidence pointing toward the exact same rough date, the exact same rough region, and the exact same general story. Bones and blood on one side of the argument, ordinary everyday words on the other. Two completely different methods arriving from two completely different directions, meeting in the middle at almost the same conclusion. Here's a question worth sitting with, especially if you have ever taken a language class and complained about how impossible vocabulary felt to memorize. Doesn't it feel strange, even slightly wonderful, that the same stubborn difficulty you experienced learning a handful of new words is the exact same stubbornness that allowed researchers centuries later to trace an entire civilization's fingerprints? Words refuse to let go easily. That turns out to be a gift for anyone patient enough to go looking for what they are still quietly holding on to. Let's talk for a moment about the sheer scale of what actually grew out of that single mother language, because I think the number tends to surprise people the first time they actually hear it stated plainly. Somewhere between 3 and 4 billion people alive on this planet right now speak a language that traces its roots directly back to whatever these wagon-travelling families were speaking as they crossed that grassland. English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Russian, Hindi, Bengali, Persian, Punjabi. Dozens upon dozens of others spanning nearly every populated continent on Earth. Roughly half of the entire population of this planet, give or take, currently communicates using some distant descendant of a language that had no writing system, no dictionaries, and probably no idea it was about to become the most successful language family human beings have ever produced. No other language family on the planet even approaches that particular reach, not because this one was inherently better suited for communication than any other, but simply because the people carrying it kept moving, kept marrying into new communities, and kept passing those particular sounds down to one more generation over and over for roughly 250 generations in a row. I find myself thinking about this most often in the quietest, least dramatic moments, honestly not while reading a research paper, but while doing something as ordinary as calling out to somebody I love across a room. Every time any of us says a word for mother, or counts on our fingers, or points at something rolling by and calls it a wheel, we're technically reaching backward across roughly 5,000 years and touching the exact same sounds a family once used sitting beside a fire on a grassland none of us will ever see with our own eyes. That is not a metaphor I am stretching for effect. Linguists can trace the actual sound changes step by careful step all the way back. There is something almost dizzying about that if you actually let yourself feel it, instead of just nodding along, the idea that the most mundane throwaway sentence you speak all day is quietly carrying passengers that boarded thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. If poor William Jones had known standing in that room in Calcutta just how enormous the argument he was starting would eventually become entire university departments, decades of academic warfare, and eventually genetic laboratories weighing in from the other side of the world, I suspect he might have poured himself something a little stronger before making that speech. Imagine spending your whole career known for legal rulings nobody remembers today, only to have your actual legacy end up resting on a hunch you had about grammar during your evenings off. There are worse ways to be remembered honestly, but I doubt it is the one he was aiming for when he sat down with those Sanskrit texts in the first place. So we now have bones confirming a migration. We have teeth confirming a complete shift in diet. We have words confirming exactly what these families were carrying with them as they travelled. What we have not yet actually done tonight is follow this story all the way to its single, most dramatic, most measurable ending. A small rain-soaked island sitting at the very edge of this entire continent, where the evidence for everything we've been discussing all evening turns out to be more extreme, more total, and more surprising than almost anywhere else these families ever reached. In May of 2002, a construction crew clearing ground for a new housing development outside the town of Amesbury in the south of England hit something that stopped the entire project cold. A digger operator doing exactly the kind of routine groundwork that happens on construction sites every single day scraped away a little too much soil in the wrong place and expose something no housing development schedule ever accounts for. Archaeologists were called in the way they always are when a builder's shovel turns up something older than expected, and what they eventually uncovered sitting quietly in the ground, only 3 miles from Stonehenge, turned out to be one of the richest graves ever found anywhere in Britain from this entire period of history. Let me actually walk you through what they found, because the sheer volume of it still catches me off guard every time I think about it. A man somewhere between 35 and 45 years old when he died, laid to rest inside a wooden chamber beneath a low earthen mound. Around him roughly 100 separate objects, an almost obscene amount of wealth for this particular moment in history. 5 decorated pottery vessels, 15 or more arrowheads along with a pair of leather wrist guards worn by archers to protect their forearm from the snap of a bowstring, 3 copper knives, a small stone used for working metal, a pair of delicate gold ornaments twisted from wire almost certainly worn in the hair, which happened to be the earliest gold objects ever discovered anywhere in England. Archaeologists working the site, only half joking, started calling him the Archer, and the nickname stuck permanently. For context, most graves from this same period in Britain contain a small handful of items at most, so finding one person buried with roughly 10 times that amount is a bit like walking through a modest village cemetery and stumbling across one single grave containing an entire jewellery store's inventory. Somebody clearly thought this particular man mattered a great deal. Here's a question worth sitting with before I tell you the part that actually matters most about this particular grave. Why do you think a single burial out of the thousands scattered across the British countryside from this same rough period ended up containing roughly 10 times the number of grave goods found in any of his neighbours' graves? What does a discrepancy that extreme usually tell us about a person's place inside their own community? Part of the answer sits in that small stone found tucked among his belongings, the one used for working metal. Metalworking at this exact moment in British history was a truly rare and valuable skill, something almost nobody on the island yet knew how to do properly. A person who could turn raw copper and gold into finished tools and ornaments was not just wealthy. He was useful in a way few others could match, the kind of specialist a community protects, honours, and eventually buries with everything it can spare. The truly fascinating twist arrived a little later, once scientists ran a particular kind of test on the enamel of the Archer's teeth. Tooth enamel, it turns out, quietly records a chemical signature of wherever a person spent their childhood, locked into the mineral structure itself and essentially impossible to fake or erase later in life. When researchers ran that test on the Archer, the results came back nothing like what anyone digging near an English monument might have expected. This man had not grown up anywhere near Britain at all. His childhood almost certainly unfolded somewhere in the foothills of the Alps, likely in the general area of modern Switzerland, hundreds of miles away, across open water and unfamiliar territory. Whatever brought him across that water opportunity, curiosity, a skill he suspected might be valued somewhere new. He made a choice that ended up defining the rest of his life, and quite possibly the futures of any children and grandchildren who came after him on that same soil. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves more weight than a quick passing mention. This was not a myth, not an inference stitched together from pottery styles, or vague cultural comparisons. This was one specific human body, with one specific traceable childhood, providing direct physical proof that a person had crossed from continental Europe into Britain, carrying metalworking skills nobody on that island had ever possessed before, and had been honoured by his adopted community with a burial richer than almost anyone else's for miles in any direction. He was not entirely alone out there either. A short distance from the Archer's own grave, archaeologists found a second burial, a younger man researchers came to call simply the Companion. Genetic testing carried out many years later, long after both men had already been resting in a museum drawer, rather than the ground revealed the two of them were near blood relatives, quite possibly father and son, or something very similar. The Companion, unlike the Archer, appears to have spent at least part of his own childhood in Britain, though isotope evidence suggests he too had spent some earlier years somewhere back on the continent. Picture that for a second, an entire small family caught mid-journey, one generation still rooted in the old world, the next already halfway settled into the new one, buried within sight of each other on a hillside neither of them had been born anywhere near. And here is the detail that I personally find almost unbearably poignant once you actually sit with the dates involved. By the time this man was born, somewhere on the far side of the water, the great standing stones at Stonehenge, The massive upright sarcens and their heavy capping lintels had very likely already been raised. He did not build that monument. He arrived into a world where it already stood ancient and established the work of people whose world was already quietly beginning to end. And yet his own community chose to bury him near enough to that same sacred landscape that whoever placed him in the ground clearly understood exactly what they were standing beside. Now, one extraordinary grave tells a powerful individual story, but I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further tonight, because a single grave, no matter how rich, is really just one data point. What turns this from a fascinating anecdote into one of the most dramatic findings in this entire field came several years later, once researchers were able to study genetic material from hundreds of ordinary British skeletons stretching across this same window of time, rather than just one especially wealthy outlier. The findings published in a major genetics journal landed with the force of an earthquake inside archaeological circles. Researchers comparing the genetic makeup of people living in Britain before this wave of newcomers against people living in Britain only a few centuries afterward found something almost impossible to soften with careful academic language. More than 90% of the genetic ancestry present in Britain before this period had essentially vanished from the population within a few hundred years, not diluted, not blended gently into a growing mixture, replaced at a scale that stunned even the researchers who ran the numbers. One of the archaeologists involved in that research later admitted in an interview given not long after publication that the team had truly expected to find evidence of gradual mixing, something closer to what happened in many other parts of the migrating world we have already spent time with tonight. What the data actually showed them was considerably more dramatic than anyone on the team had predicted going in. Here is a single statistic from that same research that I think tells the story more bluntly than any percentage possibly could. Scientists studying the specific genetic marker that only passes from father to son found that among British men living before this wave of arrivals, one particular lineage simply did not exist at all, not in a single sample tested. Among British men living afterward, that exact same lineage suddenly accounts for more than 90% of every male sample researchers were able to test. Imagine a specific surname appearing in precisely 0 families in one generation, and then showing up in the overwhelming majority of families only a handful of generations later. That is roughly the scale of what actually happened here played out across an entire island rather than a single family tree. I want to slow down and be careful here the same way I tried to be careful earlier tonight when we talked about the uneven ratio of men and women making this same journey onto the continent. A number like 90% understandably conjures images of violence, of conquest, of one people simply wiping another off the map by force. And I will not pretend that violence played no role whatsoever in a demographic shift this dramatic, because pretending otherwise would not be honest with you. But researchers studying this same period have also pointed toward other quieter mechanisms working alongside whatever conflict did occur. A newly arrived population carrying unfamiliar diseases into communities with no prior exposure. The same grim mechanism that would go on to devastate populations across multiple continents in far later chapters of history. A birth rate advantage tied to whatever made this new economy and this new set of skills more successful at raising healthy children who survived into adulthood themselves. A steady compounding social pressure generation after generation that gradually made it harder and harder for the older way of life to hold its ground. 90% replacement rarely arrives through one single cause. It tends to arrive through several quieter ones stacked on top of each other over roughly 2 or 3 centuries that must have felt to the people living through any single decade of it like nothing more dramatic than ordinary gradual change. It is worth remembering too that not every single trace of the earlier population disappeared completely. A small thread of that older ancestry does persist quietly inside people living in Britain today, easy to overlook precisely because it never again became the dominant strand in the weave. Complete disappearance and overwhelming replacement are not quite the same thing, even when the second one looks almost indistinguishable from the first at a casual glance. Can I ask you something here, because it is the question I keep coming back to myself? The people who drag those enormous sarsen stones for miles across the English countryside, who organise the labour, the diet, the sheer coordinated effort required to raise something like Stonehenge in the first place, are genetically speaking mostly missing from the population living in Britain today. Their monument still stands. Their direct genetic line for the most part does not. What do you think that says about which parts of a civilization actually managed to survive it? The physical things people build, or the biological line of people who built them? I do not think there is a comfortable, tidy answer to that question, and I am not going to pretend I have one for you tonight. What I will say is that every single person who has ever stood in front of those stones, feeling some vague, wordless sense of connection to whoever built them, has almost certainly been standing in front of a monument raised by people who are not strictly speaking their own direct ancestors at all. The stones do not know the difference. They have simply been standing there patiently watching one population quietly become another, and then watching that population slowly become the one walking around today snapping photographs at sunrise on the solstice, without ever knowing exactly which layer of history they are actually honouring. There is a strange kind of humility owed to a pile of rock that has quietly outlasted every single group of humans who ever claimed it as uniquely their own. There is something almost darkly funny in the driest possible way about how thoroughly this upends the popular image of ancient Britain as some kind of unbroken, unchanging island of tweed and standing stones stretching back into the mist of time. The truth turns out to be considerably messier, and honestly a great deal more interesting an island that changed its entire genetic identity within a span of time shorter than the gap separating any of us from our own great-great-great-grandparents, and then simply carried on building new monuments telling new stories largely unaware of just how recently and how completely the cast of characters had been swapped out underneath its own feet. Every time a costume drama sells you the idea of some ancient unbroken island bloodline stretching back to time immemorial, somewhere an archaeologist is quietly wincing into their tea. I have told you this story so far as though the science behind it were essentially settled a clean-closed case, with a tidy explanation sitting at the end of it. I want to be honest with you before we move any further tonight, because that would not quite be the whole truth. Only very recently research that truly surprised the people who published it has started complicating this exact story all over again, adding an unexpected twist to where these newcomers actually came from before they ever set foot on British soil, one that neither Stonehenge nor the Archer, nor any of the numbers we just walked through tonight had fully prepared anyone for. Even a story this well studied sitting on top of a grave, this carefully excavated, backed by genetic evidence, this overwhelming still is not finished being written. Which might be the single most honest thing I can tell you about history in general on this particular night or any other. The moment you think a chapter has closed for good is usually the exact moment someone somewhere is quietly digging up the next correction, and this next one happens to involve an entirely different corner of the map than anybody studying the Archer's grave ever expected to look toward. Here's something rather wonderful about the particular researcher who gave us that 90% figure for Britain back when we were sitting with the Archer's grave a little earlier tonight. He did not simply publish his findings and walk away from the subject forever satisfied that the case was closed. He kept digging literally and figuratively for years afterward, chasing smaller and smaller regional questions that his original headline-grabbing paper had never fully answered. And earlier this year, that same scientist, working alongside a fresh team of collaborators spread across several different countries, published something that quietly rewrites a piece of the very story he himself had helped establish less than a decade earlier. I love that about honest research, if I am being completely truthful with you. It would have been easy enough for him to simply enjoy having his name permanently attached to one of the most famous findings in this entire field and leave well enough alone. Instead, he went looking for the cracks in his own earlier picture, which is really the whole point of good science, even when it means quietly complicating a story you yourself made famous. There is a particular kind of integrity in that choice that I do not think gets celebrated nearly often enough. Quietly admitting your own earlier picture was incomplete in front of an entire field that already trusted you to have gotten it right the first time. So let's talk about what this newest research actually found, because I think it adds a layer of depth to everything we discussed about Britain that the popular version of this story almost never mentions. This is exactly the kind of finding that never makes it into a quick headline or a 2-minute news segment, precisely because it complicates a story that already felt finished and satisfying. Nuance rarely trends the way a clean dramatic claim does, which might be part of why so many people, myself included, until fairly recently never heard a word about it. Up until this point tonight, I have been telling you a fairly clean version of events. Steppe herders spread across the continent, eventually reaching the coast, eventually crossing the water into Britain, replacing the island's earlier population almost entirely along the way. That version is not wrong exactly, but it turns out to be missing an entire hidden chapter tucked away in a stretch of wetland most people have never given a second thought to. Picture the marshy, low-lying delta, where the Rhine and Meuse rivers spill out toward the sea, roughly where the Netherlands, Belgium and the western edge of Germany meet today. Soggy ground, reed beds stretching for miles, rivers constantly shifting their own course through soft waterlogged soil, swallowing whole islands of dry land one season and revealing new ones the next. Clouds of insects thick enough to make anyone reconsider their life choices the moment the sun went down. Exactly the kind of landscape that sounds miserable to farm, and as it turns out, exactly the kind of landscape that early farming communities sweeping across the rest of the continent largely could not figure out how to use properly at all, while farming spread almost everywhere else in Europe between roughly 6,500 and 4,000 years before the start of our modern calendar, essentially replacing the genetic makeup of hunter-gatherer populations everywhere it went. This one particular pocket of wetland simply refused to follow the same script. Researchers studying more than 100 individuals recovered from this exact region, spanning an enormous stretch of time, found something researchers rarely get to document this cleanly. A population there held on to roughly half of its ancestry from the original hunter-gatherers who had lived on that land for nearly 3,000 years, longer than almost anywhere else on the continent managed to hold on to anything similar. 3,000 years. Let that actually sit with you for a moment, because it is easy to let a number that size slide past without feeling its weight properly. While farmers were transforming nearly every other corner of Europe generation after generation, this one soggy, mosquito-ridden, endlessly flooding delta quietly kept doing things its own way, trading ideas and occasional marriages with neighbouring farming communities without ever fully surrendering its own older identity. Here's a question worth turning over in your own head for a second. Why do you think it was specifically the wetlands that managed to hold out this long, when almost every other landscape in Europe eventually gave way? My own honest guess, and researchers studying this region, seem to lean towards something similar, is that the very qualities making this ground miserable for early farmers were exactly what protected the people already living there. Early farming as it existed at this point in history depended on relatively dry, stable, tillable soil. The kind of predictable ground that lets you plant a field in spring and reasonably expect to still find it there come autumn. A landscape that kept shifting its own riverbanks, flooding on its own schedule, refusing to sit still long enough for a permanent field to take root, simply was not offering early farmers the advantage they needed to sweep through the way they had everywhere else. The rich, dry loess soils that made farming so devastatingly successful elsewhere on the continent simply were not on offer here, and without that particular advantage the newcomers had far less reason to push hard into ground that fought back at every turn. Sometimes the winning strategy in history is not strength or cleverness or even numbers. Sometimes it's simply living somewhere so thoroughly unglamorous, so persistently damp and difficult that nobody else wants to bother taking it from you. Now here is where this quietly reshapes everything we discussed earlier tonight about Britain. Around 4,500 years ago, give or take, that long-isolated wetland population finally did blend with newly arrived steppe-descended migrants, moving through the region the same broader corded ware movement we spent real time with a little earlier. But the resulting community was not simply a fresh, uncomplicated arrival of steppe ancestry stamped onto a blank slate. It was a genuine fusion, an estimated 80% or so tracing back to those corded ware migrants, alongside a meaningful lingering 15% or so, still tracing directly back to that ancient stubborn population of local wetland foragers, carrying ancestry all the way back to the original hunter-gatherers of that landscape threaded quietly into the mix. Small as that 15% might sound, sitting next to a much larger number, it represents thousands of years of survival, stubbornly refusing to disappear completely, even at the exact moment its carriers were finally, fully absorbed into a much larger, much newer population. And it was this specific hybrid wetland-born population, not some undiluted wave straight off the open steppe, that went on to become the driving force behind the Bell Beaker expansion into Britain. When the Archers people crossed that stretch of water and began reshaping the island's entire genetic makeup, they were not carrying a pure, uncomplicated signal all the way from the grassland where this whole story of ours began. They were carrying something considerably more tangled, a signal that had already passed through one entire hidden detour, one small, waterlogged corner of the continent before it ever reached British soil at all. There is a smaller, almost mischievous detail buried inside this same research that I think deserves its own moment, because it quietly undercuts an assumption most of us, myself included, would probably make without even noticing we were making it. In parts of the low-lying Netherlands communities that started making and using corded ware-style pottery, adopting the look, the technique, the whole visible cultural package associated with these steppe-descended migrants, turn out to have carried almost none of the actual steppe ancestry that supposedly came bundled along with it. Meanwhile, at least some of the men in these same communities did carry the particular paternal lineage typically associated with those migrants. Which means, in this one specific pocket of the map, culture and genetics seem to have travelled down two entirely separate tracks, style spreading one way, bloodline spreading another, only loosely overlapping rather than moving as a single tidy package. It is a small but truly important reminder that a shared pottery style sitting in a museum case never automatically tells you who was actually related to whom. Can I be honest with you about how much I love this particular detail? It means a thread of the very oldest hunter-gatherer ancestry in northwestern Europe, people who'd been living on that landscape since long before farming, long before wagons, long before anyone had ever heard of a place called the steppe, managed to survive hidden inside the bloodline of the very migration that eventually overwhelmed nearly everyone else's ancestry across an entire island. The old world was not simply erased by the new one arriving from the east. A small stubborn piece of it rode along inside the new arrivals themselves, smuggled quietly forward generation after generation, disguised as something else entirely. I keep coming back to how strange that particular arrangement is if you really sit with it. The population that eventually helped erase 90% of Neolithic Britain was itself quietly part descendant of one of the oldest surviving hunter-gatherer lines left standing on the entire continent. The story we usually tell ourselves, old world swept away by new world, does not really have room for a detail like that. Reality once again turns out to be woven from more threads than any tidy summary ever wants to admit. There is another wrinkle buried inside this same research that I think deserves a moment of your attention, because it complicates a pattern we spent real time with earlier tonight. Remember that striking uneven ratio of men to women, making the broader journey out of the steppe into much of the rest of the continent, the one that raised such uncomfortable questions when we first discussed it. This particular fusion out in the wetlands looks noticeably different. Researchers studying it found evidence of migrants arriving from both sides, men and women together, rather than the heavily lopsided pattern showing up almost everywhere else. Whatever unfolded in this one specific corner of the map, it does not appear to have followed the same harsh demographic script we described for the wider continent. And yet once this new blended population later pushed onward into Britain itself, the pattern shifted again, leaning back toward male-dominated movement local island communities on the receiving end, apparently absorbing new arrivals while holding on to pieces of their own distinct identity a little longer than researchers previously assumed before eventually being folded into the larger population almost entirely. I think that detail matters enormously. And here is my honest opinion about why. It would be tempting and honestly a little lazy to describe this entire 5,000-year story as one single, uniform wave, the same mechanism repeating itself identically everywhere it touched down. The actual evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with that kind of tidy simplicity. Every single region this migration reached seems to have experienced its own particular version of contact, sometimes heavily male-biased, sometimes considerably more balanced, sometimes involving one small stubborn population quietly protecting a fragment of something far older than the migration itself. A river valley in Germany told one version of this story. A wetland delta in the Netherlands told a noticeably different one. An island across open water told yet another version, again shaped by its own particular mix of geography, timing, and sheer accident. History, once you actually look closely enough, almost never repeats itself in identical fashion. It rhymes loosely, region by region, each verse carrying its own particular local twist. Here's a question worth sitting with as we get ready to move on tonight. If a discovery this significant only became public earlier this year, how many other quiet corrections do you imagine are currently sitting in some laboratory right now, waiting for the right combination of better tools and enough patience to finally come to light? Every single thing we have discussed tonight, the funeral, the wagons, the genetic tsunami, the language, the island, all of it represents our best current understanding. None of it is necessarily the final word, and I happen to find that far more exciting than unsettling. A finished, permanently settled version of history would honestly be a little disappointing to sit with on a night like this one. Part of what makes this whole subject worth returning to again and again is knowing that somewhere right now, another patient researcher is quietly staring at a spreadsheet full of numbers that might just rewrite another piece of everything we think we already understand. So we now know that the story of Britain was never quite as simple as one people arriving and erasing another completely. Hidden inside that dramatic replacement was an even older survival story, a pocket of ancient Europe that outlasted farming itself by 3,000 years, only to eventually ride quietly into an island's bloodline disguised as something entirely different. Which raises an obvious question worth sitting with as we turn toward what remains of all this inside our own bodies tonight. If a thread this old, this stubborn managed to survive hidden inside a much larger migration, without anyone even suspecting it was there for thousands of years afterward, what else might still be quietly riding along inside? Every one of us passed down without our knowledge, waiting for the right test, the right question, or the right sleepless night like this one to finally be noticed. I want to start this next stretch of the story with a small confession because I think it sets up everything else we're about to cover tonight rather nicely. For the longest time, I personally assumed that the herding families we've spent all evening following the ones who built an entire migration around milk cheese and whatever early fermented dairy they were carrying in leather bags on the side of a wagon must have been perfectly comfortable drinking a fresh cup of milk themselves. It seemed like the obvious assumption. It also turns out to be almost certainly wrong, and honestly it made me feel a little better about my own occasional oat milk order the next time I ordered coffee. Here is what the actual genetic evidence tells us, and I promise this connects directly to something sitting in your own refrigerator right now. The specific genetic switch that allows an adult human body to keep digesting milk properly, well past childhood, was still remarkably rare during the exact centuries we've spent all night discussing. Researchers scanning ancient skeletons from this period find the mutation only occasionally scattered here and there, never anywhere near common. Which means most of the actual people crossing that grassland with their wagons and their herds were by modern standards almost certainly lactose intolerant, the same way a large share of adults around the world still are today. They were not lying about loving dairy, they simply were not drinking much of it fresh. Fermentation does the heavy lifting instead, turning milk into yogurt or a simple soft cheese, breaking down most of the lactose along the way and leaving something a lactose-intolerant adult stomach could actually handle without complaint. It is a small practical solution patiently worked out over generations long before anyone involved had the faintest idea what lactose even was, only that some versions of milk sat easier in the stomach than others. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second, especially if you happen to be someone who pours milk into your coffee every single morning without a second thought. If the ability to comfortably drink a glass of milk was not really the invention of the people who built their entire economy around dairy in the first place, whose invention was it, and when did it actually happen? The honest answer arrived only very recently, and it is stranger and considerably more moving than almost anyone studying this question originally expected. A team of researchers built what might be the largest database ever assembled for this particular question, examining fat residue baked into nearly 7,000 ancient pottery fragments, pulled from over 500 archaeological sites scattered across the continent, alongside genetic data tracking exactly when and where the actual mutation for adult milk digestion started spreading. Think about the sheer patient labour sitting behind a project like that. Thousands of broken pot fragments, each one individually tested for microscopic traces of fat residue baked into the clay thousands of years ago, cross-referenced against burial sites hundreds of miles apart. Their goal was simple enough on paper. Confirm that drinking more milk generation after generation gradually made the ability to digest it more common, the way you might expect a useful trait to spread once people started relying on it. What they actually found upended that tidy assumption almost completely. Milk had already been part of the human diet across huge stretches of Europe for thousands of years before this particular genetic mutation ever really took hold in any meaningful way. People were drinking dairy in one processed form or another for millennia, while remaining almost entirely unable to digest it comfortably in its raw, unfermented state. The mutation itself barely moved in frequency for thousands of years, staying rare. Almost a curiosity right through the entire period we've spent tonight following wagons and herds across an entire continent. It only began climbing sharply, turning from rare into common much later, well into the Bronze Age, long after the original migration had already run its course. So if it was not simply drinking more milk that pushed this trait forward, what actually did? The answer researchers eventually landed on involves two of the oldest, harshest pressures a population can possibly face: famine and disease. Picture a stretch of truly difficult years, crops failing, herds thinning, ordinary food supplies running dangerously short across an entire community. In a crisis exactly like that, one milk becomes something considerably more valuable than a beverage. It becomes one of the only remaining sources of real calories and nutrition still technically available, sitting right there inside every cow, goat and sheep a family still owned. For someone unable to digest it properly, drinking milk during a famine meant trading one kind of suffering for another. Painful cramping, dangerous diarrhea, a body pushed even closer to collapse rather than pulled back from the edge of it. For the rare person who happened to carry that unusual mutation, the same desperate glass of milk was not punishment. It was simply food absorbed cleanly, keeping a starving body alive just a little longer than the neighbours around them. Layer disease on top of that same picture, outbreaks of gut infections sweeping through crowded, stressed communities, and the advantage compounds even further. Whoever could still safely drink milk during exactly the moments everyone else's digestive system was already struggling had one more quiet edge working in their favour. Generation after generation, crisis after crisis. I find something almost unbearably human hiding inside that particular mechanism, if I am honest with you. We tend to imagine evolution rewarding comfort, convenience, whatever makes ordinary daily life a little easier. This particular trait, one that a huge share of people watching tonight carry inside their own bodies without ever thinking twice about it, was not really built by comfort at all. It was built by hunger, by outbreaks of sickness sweeping through desperate, struggling communities generation after generation, quietly deciding who lived long enough to have children of their own and who did not. There is nothing gentle about that particular filter. It is one of the harshest, most unforgiving mechanisms evolution has to offer, and it happens to be sitting quietly inside a glass of milk most of us have never once thought to question. Every time you pour milk into your coffee tomorrow morning without a second thought, you are casually enjoying the end result of a filter, this brutal, refined over roughly 4,000 years of famine and disease, deciding family by family who got to keep going. There is a second, quieter inheritance worth mentioning briefly here too before we move towards something considerably heavier. Alongside milk, that same steppe ancestry appears to have nudged the average height of northern Europeans upward over the following millennia, part of a broader genetic legacy that still shows up clearly on modern population surveys today, one small thread among many contributing to why average heights vary as noticeably as they do across different regions of the same continent. It is a smaller story than the one we're about to get into, but worth knowing all the same next time somebody jokes about a particular nationality being unusually tall, since they might be closer to an actual genetic explanation than they realize. Now here is the part of tonight's story I have honestly been sitting with the longest while preparing all of this for you, because it carries a weight the milk story simply does not. A team of researchers publishing their findings at the start of last year went looking through an enormous collection of ancient genomes, thousands of samples gathered over years of careful excavation and sequencing for the deep origins of a modern disease, multiple sclerosis, a lifelong condition where a person's own immune system mistakenly attacks the protective coating around their nerves. Doctors have known for a long while that this particular disease shows a strange, stubborn pattern across Europe, considerably more common the farther north you travel, rarer as you move south toward the Mediterranean. Nobody had a fully satisfying explanation for why that particular gradient existed, not until researchers started comparing it directly against the ancient migration we've been tracing together all night. What they found was almost eerie in how precisely it lined up. One particular genetic variant sitting inside a cluster of genes responsible for recognizing and fighting off infection carries nearly 3 times the ordinary risk of developing multiple sclerosis on its own, a truly striking number in a field where most individual genetic effects are barely noticeable at all. Researchers tracing that exact variant back through thousands of years of ancient DNA found it barely present at all before the rise of the herding cultures we spent tonight following, appearing in only a single early farming individual in Italy, then rapidly increasing in frequency at almost precisely the same moment those herding cultures were taking shape out on the steppe. Trace where that same variant sits most densely inside modern populations today, and the map is almost identical to the modern distribution of steppe ancestry itself, highest in places like Finland, Sweden and Iceland, thinning out steadily the farther south you travel. Here is the piece that truly startled the researchers who ran this study, and I think it deserves to startle you a little too. This variant was almost certainly not a mistake, not some unlucky flaw riding along by accident. Everything about how quickly it spread suggests it was actively helpful to the people carrying it at the time, most likely sharpening their immune defenses against whatever new diseases came bundled along with living in near constant contact with large herds of animals, and with the sheer amount of new contact a mobile, expanding population inevitably runs into as it crosses into unfamiliar territory. A stronger, more aggressive immune response was quite literally a survival advantage 5,000 years ago. It just happens to come with an unfortunate side effect once you drop that same immune system into a completely different world, cleaner, safer, with none of the specific ancient threats it originally evolved to fight. Sometimes it simply turns that same aggression inward instead, with nothing outside left worth attacking. Can I share an honest thought with you here, because it is the one I keep circling back to myself? It seems almost cruelly unfair on the surface that a trait which once kept someone's ancestor alive through a dangerous disease-ridden migration might now be quietly increasing somebody's own risk of a difficult lifelong illness, thousands of years later, through absolutely no fault or choice of their own. But I do not think unfair is really the right word for it once you sit with it a little longer. It is simply what a very long, very complicated inheritance actually looks like once you stop pretending it only ever hands down convenient things. We inherit the milk and the height, alongside the risk and the vulnerability, all of it braided together inside the exact same handful of ancient decisions made by people who could not possibly have known any of us would still be living with the consequences this many thousands of years later. Here's a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment without any pressure to answer it out loud to anyone. If you could somehow sit down with the actual family, whose choices, whose survival, whose particular set of genetic advantages and disadvantages eventually became your own, what would you actually want to ask them? Whether they knew what they were passing down, whether they would have done anything differently if they had known, or simply what an ordinary evening sitting beside their own fire actually felt like from the inside before any of this had a name, a date, or a research paper attached to it. If any of what I've just described happens to sound personally familiar to you, or to someone you love, I want to say clearly that none of this is about blame or fault or anything an individual family did wrong along the way. It is simply what it means to be a living, breathing continuation of an extraordinarily long, extraordinarily complicated story, one written by circumstances nobody involved ever had any real control over. If this particular topic touches a nerve for you tonight in either sense of that phrase, please be gentle with yourself and know that support and real medical guidance exist for exactly this reason, offered by people far more qualified than a bedtime history video to walk alongside you through it. We've now traced this story through bone, through blood, through soil, through language, and tonight through the very cells quietly keeping each of us alive right now, this moment as you listen. 5,000 years compressed down into a handful of hours, a family on a grassland, a golden coastline gone quiet, a wagon, a wave of blood and language sweeping across an entire continent, an island transformed twice over, and now, finally, a few stubborn strands of genetic code still quietly writing themselves into every single body in this room, including your own. There is only one place left for a story like this one to end, and it is not really out on the grassland at all anymore, nor on that rain-soaked island we visited a little earlier. It is considerably closer than that. It is sitting right here in this room with you in whatever quiet thoughts a night like this one tends to stir up once the lights are low enough, and the world outside has finally gone still. So let's stay in that quiet room together for just a little while longer, because I think tonight's story deserves a proper ending, rather than simply trailing off into the dark. We covered a great deal of ground tonight, more centuries than most of us will ever really be able to hold in our heads all at once, and I do not want to simply list it all back to you like a set of notes copied off a whiteboard. What I want to do instead is let it settle gently, the way the story actually deserves to settle, one soft image at a time, the way memories of a long full day tend to settle right before sleep finally takes over, no longer sharp and separate, just a warm blur of everything that happened. Somewhere behind us now, a family stood around an open grave on an empty grassland, burying a man beside a wagon and an animal, with absolutely no idea that anything they did that afternoon would ever matter to anyone beyond their own small circle of grief. Somewhere behind us, painted river towns rose, held together for 2,000 patient years by something resembling fairness, and then quietly, unglamorously came apart not through conquest, but through soil and hunger, and the same fragile human balancing act every crowded community eventually has to relearn for itself. Somewhere behind us, a family on that same grassland figured out how to turn grass itself into food that travelled, and in doing so accidentally invented one of the most successful ways of living human beings have ever stumbled into. Somewhere behind us, wealth started piling up unevenly, inside a handful of household sons inheriting from fathers, daughters crossing into unfamiliar communities to keep the whole fragile web of alliances quietly stitched together. Somewhere behind us, a myth about thundering horseback warriors turned out to be mostly wrong, and the truth an anonymous person learning to balance on an animal's back for the very first time without any equipment at all turned out to be a great deal more moving than the myth ever was. Somewhere behind us, two research teams on opposite sides of an ocean discovered entirely independently that an enormous piece of Europe's population had quietly changed hands within a few short centuries. Somewhere behind us, a British judge in a courtroom in Calcutta noticed that a sacred Indian language and the language of ancient Rome sounded suspiciously like distant cousins, and spent the rest of his life defending an idea nobody wanted to believe. Somewhere behind us, a man we decided to call the Archer crossed open water from the foothills of the Alps and was buried generations later near enough to Stonehenge that his own community clearly understood the weight of where they were laying him to rest. Somewhere behind us, an entire hidden population tucked away for 3,000 extra years inside a stretch of miserable mosquito-ridden wetland turned out to be quietly riding along inside the very migration that eventually reshaped an island none of them had ever seen. And somewhere behind us tonight we found out that the milk in your own refrigerator and a disease some of you may be quietly living with right now both trace back to the exact same small, stubborn population of grieving, hopeful, hungry human beings we started this whole evening with. That is in the end what tonight's story has actually been about. Not really about wagons or horses or ancient graves, even though we spent a great deal of time with all three. It has been about the fact that almost nobody anywhere at any point in this entire 5,000-year story ever got to stay simply purely unchangeably one thing. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment honestly, because I suspect a great many of us carry around a quiet, half-formed idea that our own particular identity, whatever nationality sits on our passport, whatever region our family has called home for as many generations as anyone can remember, represents something old, something settled, something that has always simply been this way. Tonight's story, if it has done its job properly, should have gently taken that idea apart piece by piece and shown you what was actually sitting underneath it instead. Layers. Migrations arriving on top of older migrations, arriving on top of migrations, older still, each one blending, displacing, absorbing, and eventually becoming quietly invisible inside whatever came next. If you have ever spat into a small plastic tube, mailed it off somewhere, and waited weeks for a percentage breakdown of where your own ancestors supposedly came from, I hope tonight gave you a slightly different way of looking at that report the next time you pull it up. Behind every single percentage sitting on that page is not a tidy single origin story. It is a long chain of people, just like the ones we spent tonight with, grieving, adapting, occasionally, suffering occasionally, thriving, falling in love across languages and landscapes neither side fully understood, yet simply trying to get their own children safely into the next generation. None of them knew you were coming. None of them could have possibly imagined a night exactly like this one on the other side of 5,000 years, with someone sitting quietly in the dark listening to a stranger's voice describe the outline of their own unlikely, improbable existence. Think about how many separate, fragile decisions had to go exactly the way they did for that to even be possible. A funeral that could have easily been forgotten within a generation. A dietary trick that could have failed just as easily as it succeeded. A single rider who could have simply fallen off and never tried again. A judge in Calcutta who could have kept his strange linguistic hunch to himself, rather than standing up in front of a room full of skeptics. A scientist who could have quietly let his own earlier findings stand uncorrected rather than going back to complicate them. Pull any one of those threads out of the pattern, and the rest of the weave might have come apart completely, and you specifically, you sitting exactly where you are right now, might never have existed to hear about any of it. Here is the piece of all this that I personally find myself coming back to again and again long after I've finished researching a story like this one. Every population that ever believed itself to be the final word, the settled ending, the people who were simply always going to be here turned out to be wrong. The painted farmers believed that. The grieving families on the grassland almost certainly never imagined otherwise for themselves either. The people who raised Stonehenge stone by impossible stone had no reason to suspect their own bloodline would be mostly gone from that landscape within a handful of centuries, even while their monument continued standing for thousands of years afterward. And if history has taught me anything at all worth carrying into ordinary daily life, it is a healthy, gentle suspicion of anyone in any century insisting that the world has finally permanently arrived at its last and truest version of itself. It never has yet. I doubt it started tonight. I think there is a quiet, practical kindness hiding inside that particular lesson too, one that has nothing to do with ancient graves at all. it becomes a great deal harder to look at any group of people anywhere and imagine them as some kind of fixed, unchanging category, once you have spent an evening watching how thoroughly every single population in this story turned out to be a temporary arrangement. One chapter in a much longer, messier book nobody gets to see all the way through from where they happen to be sitting. We are all, whether we like the phrasing or not, somebody's unexpected outcome. There is something quietly comforting hiding inside that idea too, if you let it settle for a moment instead of only finding it unsettling. If nobody's identity was ever really fixed, then nobody's story is really finished either. Whatever feels permanent about your own life tonight, wherever you consider home, whoever you consider family, however solid the ground beneath your particular life currently feels, all of it is simply the newest layer in a much longer, much older pattern. One day, in ways none of us can currently predict, it will become part of somebody else's layer, too quietly folded into whatever comes next, the same way Aru's small grieving family became part of yours. Think of it less like a photograph fixed and permanent the moment it was taken, and more like a river. A river never stops being the same river, even though not one single drop of water sitting in it today was there 100 years ago, or even a single season ago. The bank shifts slightly. The course bends a little differently after every hard rain. Whole islands of sediment rise up in one century and quietly wash away in the next. And yet you can still stand on the same bridge your grandparents once stood on and point down and call it the same river, without a hint of contradiction, without anyone correcting you, without it feeling like a lie in any way that matters. That more than anything else is what an identity actually is once you strip away the comforting illusion of permanence. Not a fixed photograph. A river quietly rewriting its own banks one generation at a time, while somehow still remaining unmistakably itself. I want to say something a little more personal before we wrap things up completely tonight, if you will let me. Putting a story like this together takes a genuine amount of quiet, patient work. Reading through research papers, most people will never open sitting with contested academic arguments long enough to try to represent them fairly, tracking down which findings are settled and which are still being quietly argued over in conference halls, and then trying as honestly as I know how to hand all of that back to you wrapped in something warm enough to actually fall asleep to. I do not take it lightly that you chose to spend this particular stretch of your evening here with me, instead of anywhere else on this entire platform out of every single option available to you tonight. Thank you sincerely for staying all the way through to this exact sentence. Whatever brought you here tonight, wherever you're listening from, I am truly glad you came. If tonight's story is the kind of thing you would want more of, I would love to have you back for whatever comes next. There are so many more of these long-tangled, deeply human threads still waiting to be pulled, other graves, other migrations, other quiet corrections still sitting in laboratories, somewhere waiting for the right moment to surface into a story exactly like this one. I will be back soon with another one, another corner of the past worth sitting with in the dark, and I would be glad to have you here again when it arrives. Until then, take good care of yourself and take good care of whoever happens to be sharing tonight with you wherever they are. For now, though, let the story rest exactly where it is. You do not need to remember every date, every percentage, every name we mentioned tonight. Let your mind hold on to whatever single image landed the deepest, maybe the grave on the grassland, maybe the stubborn wetland families, maybe the ordinary miracle of your own existence resting on top of all of it, and let everything else go quietly, soft around the edges the way thoughts are supposed to when a night has finally gone late enough. Let the wagon wheels stop turning now somewhere far behind you, sinking slowly into grass that has long since grown back over every track they ever left. Let the fire beside that first grave burn all the way down to embers, and then to nothing at all the way every fire eventually does. Let the stones at Stonehenge keep their own quiet watch, without you standing exactly where they have always stood, patient enough to still be there whenever you decide to think about them again. Let the tide finally come in over that quiet wetland delta, soft and unhurried, covering the reed beds until morning. None of it needs you to stay awake and hold it together any longer tonight. It has already survived 5,000 years without your help. It can certainly survive until morning. Wherever you are right now, whoever is near you, whatever tomorrow happens to hold. I hope what we walked through together tonight leaves you with a small warm sense of how enormous and unlikely your own story actually is, stitched together from thousands of years of other people's quiet decisions to keep going one more season, one more winter, one more generation at a time. Let your breathing slow down now if it has not already. Let your shoulders finally fully unclench. Whatever the day behind you looked like, it is behind you, now folded quietly into everything else that has already happened and can no longer touch you tonight. Rest well. Sleep deeply for as long as you need to. You're in every sense that actually matters a very long story that is still being written, and tonight's chapter has earned itself a gentle, well-deserved rest.